Welcome to a journey through the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers, one of the most storied franchises in professional football. Tonight, we'll explore the team's origins, from its humble beginnings through the struggles and triumphs that built a legacy. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the story of the Steelers ease you into rest. Our story begins in 1933, during the depths of the Great Depression, when America was struggling through economic hardship that touched every corner of the nation. Cities were reeling, businesses were failing, and hope was in short supply. Yet it was in this unlikely moment that professional football in Pittsburgh was born. A man named Art Rooney, a local businessman and sports enthusiast who loved both football and his city, saw an opportunity. The National Football League was still a young organization, far from the cultural and commercial giant it would eventually become, and it was looking to expand into new markets. Art Rooney paid a franchise fee of $2,500 to join the NFL. $2,500. It's a sum that seems almost impossibly small now, when NFL franchises are worth billions, when the league is a dominant force in American entertainment. But in 1933, with the country gripped by economic depression, $2,500 was a significant investment, a gamble on the future of professional football and on the city of Pittsburgh's appetite for the sport. Rooney believed in both, and he was willing to put his money behind that belief. That investment in 1933 makes the Pittsburgh franchise the oldest team in what is now the American Football Conference. The NFL structure has changed dramatically over the decades, with mergers and realignments and the eventual incorporation of teams from the rival American Football League. But through all those changes, the Steelers have endured, maintaining a continuous presence in professional football for over 9 decades now. That kind of longevity is rare in sports, where franchises move cities, fold entirely, or get absorbed into other organizations. The Steelers have remained, anchored in Pittsburgh, connected to the same family and the same community for all these years. When the team first took the field, however, they weren't called the Steelers. Art Rooney chose to name his new franchise the Pittsburgh Pirates, borrowing from the city's National League baseball team. This kind of naming convention wasn't unusual at the time. Professional sports was still finding its identity, and sharing names across different sports was common. The Pittsburgh Pirates of the NFL played through the 1930s, struggling to find success on the field, and struggling even more to find financial stability in an era when professional football was far from guaranteed to survive. Those early years were difficult. The team played in front of small crowds, lost more games than it won, and constantly battled financial pressures that threatened its existence. Professional football in the 1930s was a rough, uncertain business. Players weren't paid much, facilities were basic, and the whole enterprise operated on thin margins. Art Rooney poured his own resources into keeping the team afloat, driven by his love for football and his commitment to bringing the sport to Pittsburgh on a permanent basis. As the decade came to a close, as the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, a decision was made to change the team's name. Pittsburgh was a steel town, the heart of America's steel industry, and that identity was central to how the city saw itself and how it was seen by the rest of the nation. The massive steel mills along the rivers, the workers who labored in those mills, the industrial might that flowed from Pittsburgh to build America's cities and infrastructure. All of this was part of the city's soul. So in 1940, the Pittsburgh Pirates became the Pittsburgh Steelers, a name that honored the industry that defined the region and the working men and women who powered it. The name stuck immediately. It felt right, authentic, connected to the place and the people in a way that borrowed baseball name never quite had. The Steelers. It conjured images of strength, of toughness, of hard work and blue-collar values. It was a name that would come to define not just a football team, but an entire identity, a brand that would eventually become known around the world. But in 1940, none of that was guaranteed. The newly renamed Steelers were still struggling, still searching for success, still trying to establish themselves as a legitimate professional football organization. The struggles continued through the 1940s and 50s and into the 1960s. This was an era of frustration for Steelers fans, a long stretch of losing seasons and dashed hopes. The team would occasionally show promise, would put together a decent season or develop a promising player, but sustained success remained elusive. Year after year, the Steelers finished near the bottom of the standings, missing the playoffs, failing to compete with the league's better teams. The statistics tell a stark story. From 1933, when Art Rooney founded the franchise, through 1971, a span of nearly 40 years, the Pittsburgh Steelers won exactly one postseason game. One playoff victory in 4 decades. It's difficult to comprehend that level of futility now, knowing what the Steelers would eventually become, knowing the championships and the dynasty that lay ahead. But for those fans who supported the team through those long, difficult decades, who showed up season after season despite the losing, who maintained their faith in the black and gold even when there was little reason for optimism, those were years of testing, of patience, of loyalty that wasn't rewarded with victories. Think about what it means to follow a team for 40 years and see it win one playoff game. Generations of fans were born, grew up, and reached adulthood without ever seeing their team achieve sustained success. Fathers who brought their sons to games in the 1930s were bringing those same sons, now middle-aged men, to games in the 1960s, and the experience was largely the same. Hope at the beginning of each season, disappointment as it wore on, the resignation that came with another losing record. Art Rooney remained through it all, the constant presence, the owner who never gave up on his team or his city. He could have moved the franchise to a larger market, to a city with a newer stadium or wealthier potential fans. Other owners did exactly that during these decades, chasing better financial opportunities elsewhere. But Rooney stayed in Pittsburgh, tied to the place where he'd grown up, committed to the community that had supported his team even through all the losing seasons. He absorbed the losses financially and emotionally, kept investing in the team, kept believing that eventually, somehow, the Steelers would find a way to win. The early struggles of the Steelers are an essential part of understanding what the franchise would eventually become. The success that came later, the championships and the dynasty years, were so meaningful partly because they followed such a long period of failure. The fans who had waited so long, who had remained loyal through decades of disappointment, would eventually be rewarded in ways they could scarcely have imagined. The city that had endured those losing seasons, that had stuck with its team through the hard times, would eventually celebrate championships and see its team become one of the most successful in professional sports history. But in those early decades, from 1933 through the 1960s, none of that was certain. The Steelers were just another struggling franchise, playing in a mid-sized industrial city, trying to survive and hoping that someday, somehow, things would get better. Art Rooney's $2,500 investment looked like it might never pay off, like it might be remembered as a noble, but ultimately futile gesture, a failed attempt to bring big-time professional football to Pittsburgh. The steel mills kept running, the rivers kept flowing, and the Steelers kept playing, kept losing, kept trying. The name that honored the steel industry was in place. The black and gold colors that would become so iconic were being worn. The foundation was being laid, though no one quite knew it yet. The long, difficult years of the early era were preparing Pittsburgh and its fans for what was to come, creating a depth of appreciation and loyalty that would make the eventual success all the sweeter. As we think about those origins, about Art Rooney's gamble and the decades of struggle that followed, we're reminded that every great story has a beginning, and not every beginning is glorious. Sometimes the beginning is humble, marked by failure and disappointment, by seasons that test faith rather than reward it. The Steelers' beginning was exactly that. Humble, difficult, testing. But it was real, it was authentic, and it created the foundation for everything that would follow. From that $2,500 investment in 1933, from those struggling years as the Pirates and then the Steelers, from that single playoff victory in 40 years of trying, from all of that would eventually emerge one of the greatest franchises in the history of professional football. As the Steelers struggled through their early decades, searching for success and stability, the entire nation was pulled into a crisis that would reshape American life in profound ways. World War II arrived, and with it came challenges that extended far beyond the battlefield, touching every aspect of society, including professional football. The war years would bring some of the strangest chapters in Steelers history, moments so unusual that they almost seem fictional in the retelling. By 1943, the United States had been fully engaged in World War II for over a year. Young men across the country were being drafted into military service, leaving their jobs, their families, their normal lives behind to serve in the armed forces. Professional football players were no exception. These athletes, despite their size and strength and the entertainment value they provided, were needed for the war effort just like everyone else. And so they went, leaving their teams scrambling to find enough players to field competitive rosters. The impact on NFL teams was severe. Rosters were depleted, with star players and backups alike heading off to military service. Teams that had already been struggling financially in the pre-war years now faced the additional challenge of trying to operate with skeleton crews of players, many of whom would have been considered not quite good enough for the NFL under normal circumstances. The league itself faced an existential question. Could professional football even continue during wartime, or should it suspend operations until the war ended and the players could return? The decision was made to continue playing, to provide entertainment and a sense of normalcy for Americans on the home front who desperately needed distraction from the war news and the anxiety that came with having loved ones in harm's way overseas. But continuing to play meant finding creative solutions to the player shortage problem. And for some teams, the only solution was to combine forces, to merge rosters and operations temporarily, to create a single team with enough players to compete. The Pittsburgh Steelers and the Philadelphia Eagles found themselves in exactly this situation in 1943. Neither team had enough healthy, available players to field a full roster on their own. So Art Rooney in Pittsburgh and Alexis Thompson, who owned the Eagles, agreed to merge their franchises for the 1943 season. The combined team would be called the Steagles, a portmanteau that mashed together the two team names into something that sounded more like a strange bird than a football team. The arrangement was unusual in every way. The Steagles would play some home games in Pittsburgh and some in Philadelphia, splitting their schedule between the two cities. Players wore uniforms that combined elements of both teams' traditional colors. Coaches from both organizations shared duties, trying to merge two different systems and philosophies into something coherent. It was an awkward compromise, born of necessity rather than choice, and nobody pretended it was anything other than a wartime expedient that would end as soon as circumstances allowed. But here's the remarkable thing. The Steagles were actually decent. Playing in 1943, this merged team finished with a winning record of 5 wins, 4 losses, and 1 tie. They were competitive, they won more games than they lost, and they provided fans in both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with something to cheer about during a dark and difficult year. Players who might never have gotten a chance to play professional football under normal circumstances found themselves starting for the Steagles, rising to the occasion and proving they belonged on the field. The season was strange, certainly. Fans in Pittsburgh had to accept that their team was only partially their own, that they were sharing their Steelers with Philadelphia. The same was true for Eagles fans. The identity of both franchises was temporarily subsumed into this hybrid creation. But it worked well enough to get through the season, to keep professional football alive in both cities, to provide that entertainment and distraction that the league had promised to deliver despite the war. When the 1944 season approached, however, the situation had not improved. If anything, the player shortage had become even more severe as the war intensified and more men were called to service. The Philadelphia Eagles found a different solution for 1944, but the Pittsburgh Steelers were still in desperate straits. They needed a merger partner again, and this time they found one in the Chicago Cardinals. The Cardinals were facing the same problems the Steelers were: not enough players, not enough resources, uncertainty about whether they could field a team at all. So once again, Art Rooney agreed to merge his franchise, this time with the Cardinals, creating a combined team that would be known as Card Pit. The name was more awkward than Steagles had been, harder to say, lacking even the modest charm of the previous season's portmanteau. But the name would turn out to be the least of the team's problems. Card Pit was a disaster, an absolute, unmitigated catastrophe on the football field. The team couldn't win a game, not one. They finished the 1944 season with a record of 0 wins and 10 losses, getting outscored by their opponents by staggering margins week after week. Every Sunday brought another defeat, another humiliation, another reminder that this merged team simply didn't have the talent or the cohesion to compete at the NFL level. The losses were often lopsided, painful to watch. Opposing teams would score at will against Carpet's overmatched defense. The offense struggled to move the ball, to sustain drives, to put points on the board. Fans in Pittsburgh and Chicago watched their teams get demolished week after week, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The players were trying their best. The coaches were doing what they could with the limited talent available, but the reality was harsh. This was not an NFL-caliber team by any reasonable standard. The press had a field day with Carpet's futility. Sports writers, always quick with nicknames and always ready to mock losing teams, came up with a moniker that captured the team's complete lack of success. They called them the Carpets, as in, the team that everyone walked all over, the team that got trampled every single week. It was cruel, perhaps, but it was also accurate. Carpet was the doormat of the NFL in 1944, and everyone knew it. For fans who had endured decades of losing seasons already, who had stuck with the Steelers through all those difficult years we discussed earlier, the Carpet season represented perhaps the lowest point in franchise history. At least when the Steelers were losing on their own, they were still the Steelers, still had their own identity. But Carpet was something else entirely, a temporary hybrid that belonged fully to neither city, that played without pride or hope, that existed only because the war had made it necessary. Players from that Carpet team later recalled the season with a mixture of humor and pain. They had been part of something historically bad, and they knew it. But they also understood the context, understood that they were playing during extraordinary circumstances, that the fact that professional football was happening at all during wartime was remarkable. They had done their best with what they had, and if that best wasn't good enough to win even a single game, well, at least they had tried. The 1944 season finally ended, and with it ended the Carpet experiment. Nobody was sorry to see it go. The Steelers would return to operating as an independent franchise in 1945, and while they still wouldn't be very good, the war was still ongoing and players were still in short supply. At least they would be themselves again, the Pittsburgh Steelers in name and in fact, no longer tied to another city's franchise in an awkward wartime marriage. Looking back on the Steelers and Carpet seasons now, they seem almost surreal, like something out of an alternate history rather than actual NFL history. It's difficult to imagine in today's carefully managed, billion-dollar professional sports landscape that teams would simply merge for a season or two, that franchises would temporarily cease to exist as independent entities. But wartime brings extraordinary measures, and professional football in the 1940s was far from the stable, wealthy institution it would later become. These strange seasons became part of Steelers lore, stories that get told when discussing the franchise's long history. The Steelers' surprising competitiveness, the Carpet's complete futility, both became footnotes in the larger story. Unusual chapters that illustrated both the resilience of professional football and the depths of struggle that the Steelers organization endured in their early decades. Art Rooney, through it all, kept faith. He guided his franchise through these bizarre wartime experiments, accepted the necessity of merging with other teams to survive, and never wavered in his commitment to Pittsburgh. When the war finally ended, when players began returning from military service, when professional football could return to something resembling normalcy, the Steelers were still there, still fighting, still searching for the success that had eluded them for so long. The war years were strange and difficult, testing the resolve of everyone involved in professional football. For the Steelers, those years meant surrendering their independence temporarily, playing as the Steelers, and then as the humiliating Carpets, enduring losses and mockery, and the uncertainty of whether any of it was even worth continuing. But they endured, they survived, and when normal times returned, the Pittsburgh Steelers were still standing, ready to continue their long journey toward respectability and, eventually, toward greatness that no one in those dark days of 1943 and 1944 could possibly have imagined. As the war ended and normalcy began to return to professional football, the Pittsburgh Steelers continued their search for identity and success. But even in those struggling years, even as the wins remained elusive and the playoff appearances rare, certain elements were coming together that would define the franchise for generations. These weren't about victories or championships. Those would come much later. These were about identity, about creating something that connected the team to its city and its people in ways that transcended the scoreboard. The colors tell part of this story. Black and gold. Simple, bold, unmistakable. When you see those colors together in Pittsburgh, you know immediately what they represent. The Steelers wear black and gold, yes, but so do the Pirates in baseball, so do the Penguins in hockey. Pittsburgh's professional sports teams share these colors, creating a unified identity that's unique in American sports. In most cities, each team has its own distinct color scheme, creating separate visual identities. But Pittsburgh chose a different path, one where all the major sports teams would wear the same colors, would represent the city through the same visual language. This wasn't an accident or a coincidence. It was a deliberate choice, rooted in civic pride and a desire to create unity. Black and gold are the colors of Pittsburgh's city flag, the colors that have represented the city officially for well over a century. When the Steelers adopted these colors, when they chose to align themselves with the same palette that the Pirates had been using since the late 1940s, they were making a statement about belonging, about being genuinely part of Pittsburgh rather than just a team that happened to play there. The connection runs deeper than simple aesthetics. These colors came to represent something about the city's character, about the working-class identity that defined Pittsburgh through the steel era. Black like the coal that powered the mills, like the smoke that rose from the factories, like the grit and toughness of the workers who built America's industrial might. Gold like the value of what they produced, like the pride they took in their work, like the hope that even in difficult times, something precious could be forged through hard labor and determination. When Steelers fans wear black and gold, when they see those colors on jerseys or flags or face paint, they're connecting to something larger than just a football team. They're expressing identity, declaring allegiance not just to the Steelers, but to Pittsburgh itself, to everything the city represents and has represented through its long history. This unified color scheme across all major sports created a visual identity for Pittsburgh that's instantly recognizable. That's become part of how the city is perceived nationally and internationally. The helmet design became another defining element of the Steelers' identity, though it arrived through an unusual path. In 1962, the team made a decision that would create one of the most distinctive looks in professional sports, though nobody quite realized it at the time. They adopted the steel mark logo, a design that had been created by U.S. Steel to promote the steel industry. The logo featured 3 hypocycloids, those diamond shapes that most people call stars or asterisks, in yellow, red, and blue, arranged around the word steel. The steel mark was perfect for the team that bore the name Steelers, a visual representation of the industry that defined their city. It connected the football team directly to Pittsburgh's economic heart, to the mills and the workers and the industrial legacy that had made the city important. When the Steelers placed this logo on their helmets, they were making a statement about who they were and what they represented. But here's where it gets interesting. The original plan was to put the steel mark on both sides of the helmet, following the standard practice in football where helmet designs are symmetrical. However, in that first season of 1962, the equipment manager applied the logo to only one side of each helmet, the right side. The story goes that this was intended as a test, to see how the logo would look, with the plan being to add it to the other side once they were satisfied with the appearance. The Steelers had a terrible season that year, winning only 9 games combined in 1962 and 1963. But something curious happened. The one-sided logo stuck around. Whether through superstition or simple oversight, or a growing fondness for the asymmetrical look, the team never added the logo to the left side of the helmet. That test became permanent. That temporary decision became tradition. To this day, more than 60 years later, the Pittsburgh Steelers remain the only NFL team to have a logo on just one side of their helmet. This quirk became part of the team's identity, one of those small details that made the Steelers distinctive and recognizable. When you see a Steelers helmet from the left side, it's just plain gold. No logo, no decoration, nothing but that metallic gold surface. From the right side, you see the steel mark in all its colorful glory. It creates an asymmetry that shouldn't work, but somehow does. That feels right precisely because it's unusual, because it sets the Steelers apart from every other team in the league. Fans embraced this quirk, this accidental tradition that had been born from a simple test that was never completed. The one-sided logo became as much a part of Steelers' identity as the black and gold colors themselves. It was distinctive, memorable, and connected to a story, And sports fans love stories, love the little bits of history and happenstance that create the traditions they come to cherish. Beyond the visual identity, beyond the colors and the logo, there was something else providing stability and continuity to the franchise: the Rooney family. Art Rooney had founded the team in 1933, and unlike many sports franchises that changed hands repeatedly over the decades, the Steelers remained under Rooney family control. When Art passed away in 1988, his son Dan took over operations. When Dan passed away in 2017, his son Art Rooney too assumed the presidency. 3 generations of the same family, guiding the franchise through nearly 9 decades of history. This continuity is genuinely rare in professional sports. Most franchises change ownership multiple times over their existence, with each new owner bringing different philosophies, different priorities, different visions for what the team should be. These ownership changes can create instability, can disrupt the organizational culture, can lead to dramatic swings in direction as new leadership tries to impose its will. The Steelers never experienced this kind of disruption. The Rooney family provided a steady hand, a consistent philosophy, a commitment to certain values that persisted regardless of whether the team was winning or losing. Art Rooney was beloved in Pittsburgh, known affectionately as the Chief. He was accessible and humble, the kind of owner who would talk with fans on the street, who never put on airs despite owning a professional sports franchise. He cared deeply about his players, treating them with dignity and respect even in an era when players had little power or security. He was patient through all those losing seasons, never panicking, never making rash decisions, always believing that if they kept working at it, if they built the organization the right way, success would eventually come. That patience and stability, that commitment to doing things the right way even when results weren't immediate, became part of the organizational culture. The Steelers developed a reputation as a well-run organization, a place where people wanted to work, where coaches could build programs without fear of being fired after one bad season, where players were treated fairly. This culture didn't guarantee wins. The team still struggled through the 1950s and 60s, but it created a foundation, a set of values and practices that would eventually support the success that was to come. Dan Rooney carried forward his father's legacy, maintaining the family's commitment to stability and to doing business with integrity. He was instrumental in many of the decisions that would eventually turn the franchise around, and he remained active in team operations for decades, providing that same steady leadership his father had provided. The continuity from Art to Dan to Art too meant that institutional knowledge was preserved, that lessons learned weren't lost when leadership changed, that the franchise maintained its character and identity across generations. This stability extended to other aspects of the organization as well. The Steelers developed a reputation for loyalty, to coaches, to players, to staff members. When they found people who fit their culture and their vision, they tended to keep them, to invest in them, to build long-term relationships rather than constantly churning through personnel. This created a sense of family within the organization, a feeling that the Steelers were different from other teams, that being part of this franchise meant being part of something stable and enduring. The black and gold colors connecting the team to Pittsburgh's civic identity. The one-sided steel mark logo that began as a test and became tradition. The Rooney family's 3 generations of steady ownership and leadership. These elements combined to create a foundation, an identity that was about more than just football. The Steelers were becoming inseparable from Pittsburgh itself, representing the city's values, embodying its character, creating a bond with the community that would endure through wins and losses, through championship seasons and rebuilding years. As the 1960s drew to a close, as the franchise approached 4 decades of mostly futility, these foundational elements were in place. The identity was established, the stability was there, the connection to the city was deep and authentic. What was missing, still, was success on the field, was winning, was playoff victories and championships. Those years of struggle, those decades of losing, had tested the patience of everyone involved. But the foundation was solid, the identity was clear, and though no one quite knew it yet, everything was about to change. The long years of struggle were nearly over, and the Pittsburgh Steelers were about to become one of the greatest dynasties in the history of professional football. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, change was sweeping through professional football, and through Pittsburgh itself. The city was evolving, moving beyond its purely industrial identity into something more complex and modern. The steel industry that had defined Pittsburgh for so long was beginning its slow decline, as foreign competition and changing economics reshaped American manufacturing. But even as the mills started closing, even as the city faced uncertain economic times ahead, something new was being built, a stadium that would house the Steelers and become home to some of the most memorable moments in sports history. Three Rivers Stadium rose at the confluence of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers, the three waterways that come together in downtown Pittsburgh to create one of America's most distinctive urban landscapes. The location was symbolic, placed at the literal meeting point of these rivers that had carried steel and coal and the products of Pittsburgh's industry for generations. Construction had begun in 1968, and by the summer of 1970, the stadium was ready to open its gates. The new facility was part of a broader wave of stadium construction happening across America in the late 1960s and early 70s. Cities were building multi-purpose stadiums, circular concrete bowls designed to host both football and baseball, with movable seating sections that could be reconfigured depending on which sport was being played. These stadiums weren't architectural marvels. They were functional, sometimes even ugly, with their cookie-cutter designs and artificial turf and lack of distinctive character. But they were new, they were modern, and they represented cities' commitments to keeping their professional sports teams for decades to come. For the Steelers, moving into Three Rivers Stadium meant leaving behind Forbes Field, the aging baseball park they had shared with the Pirates for years. Forbes Field had history and charm, but it was built for baseball, and football there always felt somewhat improvised, with sightlines that weren't ideal and facilities that were outdated. Three Rivers offered something better, a venue designed with football in mind, where fans would have clear views of the action, where the team would have modern locker rooms and training facilities, where everything felt appropriate for a professional football franchise rather than borrowed from baseball. The timing of the move was significant in another way. The year 1970 marked the completion of the AFL-NFL merger, the unification of the two rival professional football leagues that had been competing for players and fans throughout the 1960s. The merger created a single, larger NFL with two conferences, the American Football Conference and the National Football Conference. Teams were realigned, schedules were restructured, and the entire landscape of professional football was redrawn. The Pittsburgh Steelers, as one of the older NFL franchises, found themselves placed in the newly formed American Football Conference's Central Division. This realignment created new rivalries, new competitive dynamics, a fresh start in many ways. The Steelers would be competing against teams like the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals, division rivals that would battle each other twice a year, every year, creating the kind of intense, repeated competition that makes professional football so compelling. But even with the new stadium and the new league structure, success remained elusive. The 1970 season, the Steelers' first in Three Rivers Stadium, was mediocre, 5 wins, 9 losses, another disappointing year in what had become a long string of disappointments. The 1971 season was better, with the team finishing 6-8, but still not good enough for the playoffs, still not the breakthrough that fans had been waiting decades to see. And then came 1972. Something shifted that season, something fundamental. The Steelers, who had never won a division title in their entire history, who had been professional football's perennial losers for nearly 4 decades, suddenly found themselves winning. They won and won and won, stringing together victories in a way Pittsburgh fans had never experienced before. The team finished the regular season with 11 wins and 3 losses, dominating their division and earning their first ever division championship. Think about what that meant for a moment. The franchise had been playing professional football since 1933, 39 years. In all that time, through all those seasons, through the pre-war years and the wartime mergers and the post-war struggles, through the 1950s and 60s and into the early 70s, the Steelers had never once won their division, never been the best team in their competitive grouping, never earned that basic first level of achievement that most successful franchises take for granted. And now, suddenly, in 1972, in their new stadium, in the newly aligned NFL, they had done it. They were division champions. The long drought was over. The decades of futility had finally given way to something better. For fans who had supported the team through all those losing seasons, who had maintained faith when there was little reason for it, this was vindication. The patience had been rewarded. The loyalty had meant something. The Steelers were winners. But the 1972 season would be remembered for more than just that first division title, significant as that achievement was. It would be remembered for a single play, a moment so dramatic and so improbable that it would become one of the most famous plays in NFL history, replayed endlessly, discussed and analyzed and celebrated for decades to come. This was the year of the Immaculate Reception. The Steelers were hosting a playoff game against the Oakland Raiders on December 23, 1972. It was a cold, gray Pittsburgh afternoon, the kind of weather that feels appropriate for December football in western Pennsylvania. Three Rivers Stadium was packed with fans who had never seen their team in the playoffs before, who were experiencing something entirely new and thrilling. The game was tense, hard-fought, with neither team able to pull away. Late in the fourth quarter, the Steelers were losing. Time was running out. The season that had been so promising, that first division championship that had meant so much, was about to end in playoff disappointment. Quarterback Terry Bradshaw dropped back to pass, looking for a receiver who could make a play, who could extend the season for one more game. He threw the ball toward running back John "Frenchie" Fuqua, but Raiders safety Jack Tatum arrived at the same moment, creating a violent collision that sent the ball ricocheting backward, tumbling through the air in an unpredictable arc. What happened next has been analyzed frame by frame countless times. The ball, deflecting off either Fuqua or Tatum or possibly both, flew backward toward another Steelers player who happened to be in the area, Franco Harris. Harris was a rookie running back, a first-round draft pick who had shown promise during his first season but was not yet a star, not yet the player he would eventually become. In this moment, with the season on the line, Harris demonstrated the instincts and awareness that would define his Hall of Fame career. He caught the ball just inches off the ground, scooping it up at his shoe tops before it could hit the turf and become an incomplete pass. The stadium held its breath for just a fraction of a second as Harris secured the ball, and then erupted as he began to run. The Raiders players, caught off guard by the deflection, were out of position. Harris had a clear path down the sideline. He ran, the roar of the crowd building with every step, 50 yards to the end zone, scoring the touchdown that would win the game and send the Steelers to the AFC Championship. The play was immediately controversial. Raiders players and coaches argued that the ball had touched Fuqua, which under the rules of the time would have made the catch illegal. A receiver couldn't catch a ball that had been touched by another receiver without a defensive player touching it in between. The officials conferred, discussed, reviewed what they had seen. In an era before instant replay review, they had to rely on their own eyes and their best judgment. After what seemed like an eternity to the fans in the stadium and watching at home, the ruling came, touchdown. The play would stand. The Steelers had won. Franco Harris, thinking quickly in the aftermath, suggested a name for the play. He called it the Immaculate Reception, playing off the Catholic concept of the Immaculate Conception, suggesting that the catch was so perfect, so miraculous, that it deserved a name that reflected its almost divine nature. The name stuck immediately. Within days, everyone in football was calling it the Immaculate Reception, and that name would endure for decades, becoming shorthand for one of the most famous plays in sports history. The Immaculate Reception became more than just a great play or a lucky bounce. It became symbolic, representing the moment when the Steelers' fortune changed, when decades of losing gave way to an era of winning, when everything that had been building finally broke through. The fact that it happened in the first year the team won a division title, in their new stadium, in the newly merged NFL, made it feel like destiny, like all the pieces had finally come together at exactly the right moment. For Pittsburgh fans, the play represented vindication and the beginning of something special. For the franchise, it marked a turning point, the moment when they stopped being lovable losers and started becoming champions. The Steelers would lose the AFC Championship game that year, falling short of the Super Bowl, but the foundation had been established. They had won a division title. They had won a playoff game in spectacular fashion. They had announced to the football world that the Pittsburgh Steelers were no longer a doormat, no longer a franchise content to simply exist. They were competitors now, winners, a team to be taken seriously. The move to Three Rivers Stadium, the AFL-NFL merger creating new competitive structures, the first division title after 39 years of waiting, and the immaculate reception, all of these elements combined to make 1972 a watershed year in franchise history. The long era of struggle was ending. The foundation that had been built through those difficult decades, the stable ownership, the clear identity, the connection to Pittsburgh, was about to support something remarkable. The modern era of Steelers football had begun, and the best was yet to come. As 1972 gave way to 1973 and beyond, the momentum that had been building continued to accelerate. The immaculate reception had been more than just a lucky play. It had been a signal, an announcement that the Pittsburgh Steelers were transforming from perennial losers into something entirely different. And at the center of this transformation was a coach who had arrived in Pittsburgh 3 years before that famous moment, a man who would eventually be recognized as one of the greatest coaches in football history. Chuck Noll came to Pittsburgh in 1969, hired by the Rooneys to turn around a franchise that had been struggling for its entire existence. Noll was not flashy or charismatic in the traditional sense. He didn't give fiery speeches or create controversy with bold predictions. He was measured, analytical, detail-oriented, a teacher more than a motivator, a strategist who believed in preparation and execution over emotion and inspiration. He had been an assistant coach with the Baltimore Colts, learning under the legendary Don Shula, and he brought a systematic approach to building a football team. When Noll took over the Steelers, he found a roster that needed complete reconstruction. The team had talent in scattered places, but not enough of it, and not in the right positions. So Noll set about building through the draft, identifying college players who fit his system, who had the physical tools and the mental makeup to succeed at the professional level. He looked for intelligence and toughness, for players who could adapt and learn, who could handle the complex schemes he wanted to implement on both sides of the ball. The early returns were not promising. Noll's first season in 1969 produced just one win, matching the futility of some of the franchise's worst years. The 1970 season was better, but still losing. But even during these difficult early seasons, even as critics questioned whether Noll was the right man for the job, something was being built beneath the surface. The draft picks were developing, the system was being installed, the culture was changing. Noll was patient, methodical, unwilling to take shortcuts or panic when results didn't come immediately. By 1972, the pieces were starting to fit together. Terry Bradshaw, the quarterback selected first overall in the 1970 draft, was developing into the kind of passer the team needed. Joe Green, the defensive tackle taken with the 4th overall pick in 1969, was becoming dominant, a disruptive force who could control the line of scrimmage and make life miserable for opposing offenses. Franco Harris, that rookie who had made the immaculate reception, was showing that he could be a feature back, a player who could carry the offense with his running and receiving. The 1972 division title and playoff victory had validated Noll's approach, had shown that the patient rebuilding was working. The 1973 season saw more success, another playoff appearance, more evidence that the Steelers were becoming a force in the AFC. But the team was still not quite complete, still missing a few key pieces that would take them from good to great, from playoff contenders to championship winners. And then came the 1974 draft, a draft that would become legendary, that would be studied and marveled at for decades to come, that would be called the greatest draft by any team in NFL history. The Steelers had multiple picks in the early rounds, and Chuck Noll and his scouting staff had done their homework, had identified players they believed could help immediately and could develop into stars. With their first pick, the 21st overall selection, the Steelers chose Lynn Swann, a wide receiver from USC. Swann was graceful and athletic, a player who caught passes with a balletic quality that made difficult catches look easy. He had speed and body control, the ability to adjust to throws in midair and come down with receptions even when covered tightly. On the field, Swann would become one of the most exciting receivers of his era, making acrobatic catches that would be replayed on highlight shows for years. Off the field, he carried himself with a dignity and eloquence that made him a perfect representative for the franchise. In the second round, with the 46th overall pick, they selected Jack Lambert, a linebacker from Kent State. Lambert was intense, fierce, almost frightening in his commitment to physical football. He played middle linebacker with a ferocity that intimidated opponents, flying to the ball on every play, making tackles with punishing force, leading the defense with an almost manic energy. His appearance enhanced this reputation. He was missing several front teeth, which gave him a gap-toothed snarl that became iconic, that made him look like he'd been in a street fight just before taking the field. Lambert would become the heart and soul of the Steelers' defense, the leader who set the tone and the standard for everyone around him. In the fourth round, with the 82nd overall pick, they chose John Stallworth, another wide receiver, this one from Alabama A&M, a small historically black college. Stallworth wasn't as highly touted as Swann, didn't have the same pedigree from a major program, but the Steelers scouts saw something special: intelligence, route-running ability, reliable hands. The kind of player who might not wow you with any single attribute, but who would consistently be open and would consistently catch the ball when it came his way. Stallworth would develop into one of the most productive receivers in franchise history, forming with Swann one of the greatest receiving tandems the game has seen. And in the fifth round, with the 125th overall pick, they selected Mike Webster, a center from Wisconsin. Webster was undersized for his position, not the prototypical massive offensive lineman that most teams preferred. But he was quick, intelligent, technically sound, and absolutely relentless in his approach to the game. He would become the anchor of the Steelers' offensive line, the player who made the calls at the line of scrimmage, who controlled protections and blocking schemes, who played with a consistency and durability that was remarkable even by professional standards. For players from one draft: Lynn Swann, Jack Lambert, John Stallworth, Mike Webster. All four would go on to have Hall of Fame careers. All four would be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, recognized as among the greatest players at their positions in the history of the sport. No team before or since has drafted 4 Hall of Famers in a single year. It's an achievement that stands alone in NFL history, a draft class so spectacularly successful that it seems almost impossible. The impact of these 4 players was immediate and profound. The 1974 Steelers, bolstered by this infusion of talent to complement the stars already on the roster, dominated the regular season. They won 10 games, claimed another division title, and marched through the playoffs with a confidence and physicality that opponents couldn't match. In Super Bowl IX, played in January 1975 at Tulane Stadium in New Orleans, they faced the Minnesota Vikings and won convincingly, 16-6, claiming the franchise's first championship. For a team that had waited over 40 years to win a playoff game, that had endured decades of losing and disappointment, winning a Super Bowl felt almost surreal. The celebration in Pittsburgh was enormous, with fans pouring into the streets, waving terrible towels, those gold towels that had become a symbol of Steelers fandom, and celebrating a moment that many had thought they'd never see. Art Rooney, the founder who had invested that $2,500 back in 1933, who had stayed loyal to Pittsburgh through all the difficult years, finally held a championship trophy. The patience had been rewarded. The faith had been justified. But the Steelers weren't done. Not even close. The 1975 season brought another championship, with the team defeating the Dallas Cowboys in Super Bowl X in a game that featured one of Lynn Swann's most spectacular performances: acrobatic catches that seemed to defy physics, plays that would be remembered and replayed for generations. 2 championships in 2 years. The Steelers had gone from never winning a playoff game to being defending Super Bowl champions. At the center of these championship teams was Terry Bradshaw, the quarterback who had arrived with enormous expectations as the first overall pick in 1970 and who had initially struggled with the pressure and the demands of playing the position at the highest level. Bradshaw had a powerful arm, able to throw the ball downfield with a velocity that few quarterbacks could match. But early in his career, he had been inconsistent, throwing interceptions, making poor decisions, struggling with the complexity of reading NFL defenses. Chuck Noll worked with Bradshaw patiently, teaching him to trust his preparation, to rely on his receivers to make plays, to take what the defense gave him rather than always trying to force big plays. As Bradshaw matured, as he gained experience and confidence, he developed into one of the most effective big-game quarterbacks in NFL history. He may not have had the gaudy regular season statistics of some of his contemporaries. The Steelers ran the ball frequently and didn't ask Bradshaw to throw 40 or 50 times a game. But when the stakes were highest, when the pressure was greatest, Bradshaw delivered. The championships in 1974 and 1975 established the Steelers as a dynasty, but they weren't finished building. The team continued to draft well, to develop players, to maintain the core of stars while adding complementary pieces. After missing the Super Bowl in 1976 and 1977, the Steelers returned to dominance in 1978, winning another championship with a victory over the Dallas Cowboys in Super Bowl 13. And then they did it again in 1979, defeating the Los Angeles Rams in Super Bowl 14. For Super Bowl victories in 6 years. For championships in the span of the 1970s. It was a level of dominance that professional football had rarely seen, a dynasty that would be compared to the greatest teams in any sport. And Terry Bradshaw stood at the center of it, the quarterback who had struggled early but who had developed into a champion, the first quarterback in NFL history to win 4 Super Bowl rings. Bradshaw's legacy is complex and sometimes debated. Some argue he was a product of a great team rather than the driving force behind it, that the dominant defense and powerful running game made his job easier than it would have been on other teams. But 4 Super Bowl victories is an achievement that can't be dismissed or diminished. Bradshaw was the quarterback for all 4 championships, made crucial throws in all 4 games, led the offense when it mattered most. He was named Super Bowl MVP twice, recognition of his performance in the biggest games. And he became the standard against which future quarterbacks would be measured, the first to reach 4 Super Bowl victories, setting a bar that would stand for decades until Tom Brady eventually surpassed it in the 2000s. Chuck Noll, the measured coach who had arrived in 1969 with a struggling team and a systematic plan, had built something extraordinary. His 1974 draft class, with those 4 Hall of Famers selected in a single year, became the foundation of a dynasty. His patient development of Terry Bradshaw turned a struggling young quarterback into a 4-time champion. His systematic approach to building through the draft, his emphasis on preparation and execution, his calm leadership even in the most pressure-filled moments, all of it combined to create one of the greatest teams in NFL history. The 1970s belonged to the Pittsburgh Steelers. For championships, a roster filled with Hall of Fame talent, a coach who would eventually be recognized as one of the greatest ever, a quarterback who set the standard for championship success. The franchise that had struggled for 4 decades had become the standard of excellence in professional football, the team that everyone else was chasing, the dynasty that defined an era. The black and gold weren't just Pittsburgh's colors anymore. They were the colors of champions, recognized and respected throughout the football world. While Terry Bradshaw and the offensive stars captured headlines and highlight reels, while Lynn Swann made his acrobatic catches and Franco Harris powered through defensive lines, there was another unit on those championship Steelers teams that was equally important, perhaps even more defining of the team's identity and success. The defense. The Steel Curtain. A nickname that captured everything about Pittsburgh football, the toughness, the physicality, the impenetrable strength that characterized both the city's industrial heritage and the way this defense played the game. The name itself was perfect, born from a radio contest held by a local station looking to capture the essence of this dominant defensive unit. Steel Curtain. It evoked the Iron Curtain of Cold War politics, suggesting something immovable and forbidding, while connecting directly to Pittsburgh's steel industry legacy. When opponents faced the Steelers' defense, they were running into something as solid and unyielding as the steel that had been forged in Pittsburgh's mills for generations. The name stuck immediately, becoming as iconic as the defense it described. At the heart of the Steel Curtain was Mean Joe Green, the defensive tackle who had been Chuck Noll's first draft pick when he took over the team in 1969. Green had come from North Texas State, a smaller program that most NFL teams weren't paying much attention to, but the Steelers scouts saw something special. They saw a player who combined size, quickness, and an almost scary intensity, someone who could dominate the line of scrimmage and disrupt everything an opposing offense tried to do. The nickname Mean was well-earned. Green played with a ferocity that bordered on controlled rage. He would line up across from offensive linemen and simply overpower them, using his strength to push them backward, his quickness to slip past blocks, his relentless motor to chase down ball carriers and quarterbacks all over the field. But it wasn't just physical dominance. Green was intelligent. able to diagnose plays quickly, to understand what the offense was trying to do and position himself to destroy those plans before they could develop. Green became the foundation upon which the entire defense was built. From his position at defensive tackle, he could command double teams, requiring 2 offensive linemen to block him, which freed up his teammates to make plays. When offenses tried to block him with just one player, he would dominate that matchup, disrupting running plays and collapsing the pocket on passing plays. His presence changed what offenses could even attempt against the Steelers, forcing them to adjust their game plans just to account for one player. But Green wasn't alone. The defensive line was stacked with talent, with players like L.C. Greenwood and Dwight White complementing Green's interior dominance with their own pass-rushing abilities from the defensive end positions. Ernie Holmes provided additional strength in the middle. This front four was as good as any in football, able to generate pressure on the quarterback without needing to blitz, able to stuff running plays before they could develop, creating the foundation for everything the defense did. And then there was Jack Lambert, the linebacker we mentioned earlier, the second-round pick from that legendary 1974 draft. If Joe Green was the heart of the defensive line, Lambert was the soul of the entire defense. He played middle linebacker with an intensity that was almost frightening to watch, flying to the football on every play with reckless abandon, delivering hits that echoed through the stadium, leading the defense with a vocal presence that kept everyone focused and motivated. Lambert looked the part of a fearsome defender. That gap-toothed snarl, the long hair flowing from beneath his helmet, the wild-eyed intensity he brought to every snap. He seemed less like a football player and more like a warrior from some earlier, more violent age. Opposing players talked about the fear they felt when they saw Lambert coming, about how that intensity affected them even when they tried to stay focused on their assignments. He was intimidating by design, using every tool at his disposal, physical ability, appearance, reputation, to gain an advantage before the play even began. Lambert's range was remarkable. He could drop back into coverage and defend against passes, showing fluidity and awareness that was unusual for a player his size. He could blitz through gaps and pressure the quarterback, bringing speed and aggression that offensive lines struggled to account for. But mostly, he played downhill, attacking the line of scrimmage, filling running lanes, making tackles with a violence that sent a message to anyone who dared to run the ball against the Steelers. This wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't going to be fun. If you wanted to move the ball against Pittsburgh, you were going to have to earn every yard through pain and punishment. The secondary was equally talented, with players like Mel Blount and Donnie Shell providing coverage and hitting power from the safety and cornerback positions. Blount was particularly significant. He was so dominant in his physical coverage style, so effective at using his size and strength to manhandle receivers at the line of scrimmage, that the NFL eventually changed its rules to limit how much contact defensive backs could have with receivers downfield. The Mel Blount rule, as it came to be known, was implemented to help offenses have a better chance against defenses like Pittsburgh's. The fact that the league felt compelled to change its rules because of how one defender was playing speaks volumes about Blount's dominance. This steel curtain defense was the primary reason the Steelers won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years. Yes, the offense had its moments, had its big plays and crucial scores. Terry Bradshaw made important throws. Franco Harris had productive games. Lynn Swann made spectacular catches. But it was the defense that defined these teams, that gave them their identity, that made opponents fearful before they even stepped on the field. Super Bowl IX, played in January of 1975, was the franchise's first championship game appearance, the culmination of 4 decades of waiting. The Steelers faced the Minnesota Vikings, who had been to the Super Bowl twice before and lost both times, who were desperate to finally win a championship. What followed was a defensive masterpiece. The steel curtain completely shut down Minnesota's offense, holding them to just 6 points, never allowing them to reach the end zone. The Vikings managed only 17 yards rushing the entire game, a staggeringly low total that illustrated just how thoroughly Pittsburgh's defense controlled the line of scrimmage. The final score was 16-6, and while that might not sound like a dominant victory, anyone who watched the game understood that the outcome was never in doubt. The Steelers' defense suffocated everything Minnesota tried to do, turning what should have been a tense championship game into a clinical demonstration of defensive superiority. When the final seconds ticked off the clock, When the Steelers had secured their first-ever championship, it was the defense that deserved the lion's share of the credit. They had delivered the title that Pittsburgh had been waiting for since 1933. The next year brought Super Bowl X, another championship against the Dallas Cowboys. This game was more competitive, with both offenses finding some success, but again the defense made crucial plays when needed, forcing turnovers and preventing Dallas from mounting sustained drives. The pattern was established. The Steelers won with defense, with physicality, with a style of play that reflected the blue-collar values of the city they represented. After missing the Super Bowl in 1976 and 1977, seasons that were still successful but fell just short of the championship game, the Steelers returned to dominance in 1978. Super Bowl XIII saw them face Dallas again, in a game that would be remembered as one of the greatest Super Bowls ever played. This time, the offense got more attention, with Bradshaw throwing for over 300 yards and 4 touchdowns. But the defense still made critical plays, still created the foundation that allowed the offense to operate, still brought that physical presence that defined Pittsburgh football. And then came Super Bowl XIV, played in January of 1980 at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. The Steelers faced the Los Angeles Rams, who had a good team but were clear underdogs against the 3-time champions from Pittsburgh. The game was closer than many expected, with the Rams fighting hard and staying competitive into the fourth quarter. But in the end, the Steelers' experience and talent prevailed. They won 31-19, securing their 4th championship in 6 years, completing a run of dominance that had no parallel in modern NFL history. For Super Bowls 9, 13, 14. For times the Steelers stood at the top of professional football. For times they held the Lombardi Trophy. For times they proved they were the best team in the league. And in each of those championship runs, the Steel Curtain defense was the foundation, the constant, the unit that opponents had to somehow overcome if they wanted to beat Pittsburgh. The defense embodied everything Pittsburgh wanted to believe about itself. This wasn't finesse or trickery or luck. This was power, physicality, toughness. Football played the way steelworkers approached their jobs, with strength and determination and an unwillingness to yield. When Joe Green lined up across from an offensive lineman, when Jack Lambert flew to the ball, when Mel Blount used his size to dominate a receiver, they were representing something larger than just football. They were representing a city's identity, a region's values, a blue-collar ethic that believed in hard work and toughness and earning what you got through sweat and determination. The Steel Curtain defense of the 1970s set a standard that future Steelers teams would be measured against. Every dominant defense Pittsburgh fielded in subsequent decades would be compared to the Steel Curtain, asked if they could match what Green and Lambert and their teammates had accomplished. It became part of the franchise's DNA, this commitment to defensive excellence, this belief that championships were built on stopping opponents rather than just outscoring them. As the 1970s ended, as that 4th Super Bowl victory was secured, the Steel Curtain stood as one of the greatest defenses in NFL history. Multiple Hall of Famers on one unit, playing together at their peaks, creating something that transcended individual talent to become greater than the sum of its parts. They had taken a franchise that had never won anything and turned it into a dynasty. They had given Pittsburgh 4 championships in 6 years, creating memories and establishing traditions that would endure for generations. The Steel Curtain wasn't just a nickname. It was a legacy, a standard of excellence, a symbol of what Pittsburgh football meant and would always mean. Toughness, physicality, dominance. Defense that didn't just stop opponents but intimidated them. That didn't just win games but made opponents dread facing them. That was the Steel Curtain, and that was Steelers football at its absolute best. As the Steelers built their dynasty through the 1970s, as they won those 4 championships and established themselves as the dominant force in professional football, something else was happening that extended far beyond wins and losses. The team was becoming a cultural phenomenon, creating symbols and traditions that would endure long after the players retired, that would spread far beyond Pittsburgh to become recognized around the world. The Steelers were transforming from a football team into something larger, an identity, a movement, a shared experience that connected millions of people. In 1975, before a playoff game, a local radio broadcaster named Myron Cope had an idea. Cope was a distinctive figure in Pittsburgh sports media, known for his nasally voice and his passionate support of the Steelers. He thought the fans needed something tangible, something they could wave and rally around, something that would create a visible show of unity in the stands. So he suggested that fans bring gold-colored towels to the game, that they wave these towels to create noise and confusion for the opposing team, to show their support for the Steelers in a way that was both visual and participatory. The idea was simple, almost absurdly simple. Just a towel, gold-colored, about the size of a dish towel, something anyone could buy at a department store or already had at home. But Cope gave it a name that captured the spirit perfectly, the terrible towel. The word terrible wasn't meant as a negative, of course. It was terrible in the old sense, meaning awe-inspiring, fear-inducing, formidable. The terrible towel represented the power of Steelers fans, the noise they could create, the intimidation factor they could bring to home games. That first game where fans brought their towels, waving them in unison, creating a sea of gold in the stands, was electric. The energy was palpable, the visual impact undeniable. Opposing teams and their fans noticed immediately. There was something happening in Pittsburgh, something that made Three Rivers Stadium even more intimidating than it already was. The terrible towel wasn't just a gimmick or a marketing ploy. It was connecting with something real, tapping into the passion of a fan base that had waited decades to have a winner to cheer for, and was now celebrating that success with unbridled enthusiasm. The tradition grew organically from there. Fans started bringing terrible towels to every game, not just playoffs. The towels became more standardized, with official versions sold that featured the Steelers' logo and specific designs. But the homemade versions persisted too, with fans personalizing their towels, passing them down through families, treating them as treasured possessions that connected them to important moments and memories. What Myron Cope created extended far beyond just a game day tradition. The terrible towel became one of the most recognized symbols in all of sports, identified around the world as representing the Pittsburgh Steelers and their passionate fan base. Steelers fans brought their terrible towels to away games, creating pockets of black and gold in enemy stadiums, waving their towels in celebration when Pittsburgh scored or in solidarity when things weren't going well. The towel became a way to identify fellow fans, a shared symbol that created instant connection and community. The reach of the terrible towel became almost absurd in its extensiveness. Astronauts who were Steelers fans brought terrible towels into space, taking them aboard the International Space Station and photographing them floating in zero gravity against the backdrop of Earth. The towel had literally gone global, or rather, beyond global, extending into orbit. It showed up at major events around the world, at the Olympics and World Cup. Wherever Steelers fans found themselves, the terrible towel came with them. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the terrible towel tradition is what happens with the proceeds from official sales. Myron Cope, who created this symbol and could have profited enormously from its popularity, made a different choice. He directed that proceeds from official terrible towel sales benefit the Allegheny Valley School, a nonprofit organization serving individuals with developmental disabilities. Cope's son, Danny, had been born with severe developmental disabilities and had been cared for at Allegheny Valley, and Myron wanted to give back to the organization that had helped his family. Over the decades, millions of dollars have been raised through terrible towel sales, supporting the care and programs at Allegheny Valley School. Every fan waving their towel at a game, every purchase of an official terrible towel, contributes to this cause. It transforms what could have been just a commercial product into something more meaningful, something that connects Steelers fandom to charitable work, that makes supporting the team also mean supporting people in need. This aspect of the terrible towel story is less well known than the visual spectacle of thousands of gold towels waving in stadiums, but it's arguably more important, showing how sports traditions can serve purposes beyond just entertainment. As the terrible towel tradition was taking root, another phenomenon was developing that would extend the Steelers' reach far beyond Western Pennsylvania. The steel industry that had defined Pittsburgh for so long was declining through the 1970s and 80s. Foreign competition, changing economics, and shifting manufacturing patterns meant that the mills were closing, that jobs were disappearing, that workers who had built their lives around the steel industry were facing unemployment and uncertain futures. Many of these steelworkers made difficult decisions to relocate, to leave Pittsburgh and seek work in other cities, in other industries, in other parts of the country. They moved to the Sun Belt, to growing metropolitan areas, to anywhere that offered employment and opportunity. This migration scattered Pittsburgh natives across the United States, creating pockets of expatriate Pittsburghers in cities from coast to coast. But these transplanted Pittsburghers didn't leave their Steelers fandom behind. If anything, being away from home intensified their connection to the team, made following the Steelers a way to maintain ties to the place they'd left, to stay connected to their roots and their identity. They found each other in their new cities, gathering in bars and homes to watch games together, creating communities of Steelers fans in places like Phoenix and Dallas and Charlotte and Los Angeles. This diaspora created what became known as Steeler Nation, a fan base that extended far beyond Pittsburgh's geographic boundaries, that was truly national in scope. The Steelers became one of the few NFL teams with substantial fan bases in cities across the country, not just in their home market. When the Steelers played road games, their fans would show up in large numbers, sometimes seeming to outnumber the home team's fans, creating pockets of black and gold in stadiums thousands of miles from Pittsburgh. Steeler Nation became self-reinforcing. Children of those relocated steelworkers grew up as Steelers fans, even though they'd never lived in Pittsburgh, maintaining the family tradition in their new home cities. People who encountered this passionate fan base became curious about the team and sometimes converted to Steelers fandom themselves, drawn by the tradition and the community they observed. The fan base grew and spread, taking on a life of its own, becoming one of the most geographically distributed in professional sports. This national presence gave the Steelers visibility and relevance that extended beyond their on-field success. Even in years when the team struggled, when they missed the playoffs or had losing seasons, Steeler Nation remained engaged, remained visible, remained passionate. The fan base became part of the team's identity, as recognizable as the black and gold colors or the terrible towel, a demonstration of loyalty that persisted through both triumph and disappointment. The marketing and branding of the Steelers leaned heavily into the blue-collar, working-class identity that Pittsburgh represented. This wasn't accidental or superficial. It was authentic, rooted in the reality of what the city had been and what many of its people still valued. The team embraced the steel industry imagery, the tough, physical style of play, the lunch pail mentality that said you showed up and did your job regardless of circumstances. This blue-collar identity resonated far beyond just Steelers fans. It appealed to working-class people across the country who saw something of themselves in the team's approach, in the toughness and determination that characterized Steelers football. The team became a symbol for a certain set of values: hard work, perseverance, toughness, loyalty, that transcended sports to tap into deeper cultural beliefs about what matters and what's admirable. The black and gold colors, shared with Pittsburgh's other professional teams, reinforced this civic connection. When you wore Steelers gear, you weren't just supporting a football team. You were expressing allegiance to Pittsburgh itself, to everything the city represented. For people who had left the city but maintained emotional ties to it, Steelers merchandise became a way to express that connection, to signal their origins and their identity even while living thousands of miles away. The transformation was complete. The Steelers had evolved from a struggling franchise into a cultural institution. The terrible towel waving in stadiums around the world and even in space. Steeler Nation scattered across the country but united in their passionate support. The blue-collar identity that connected the team to broader American working-class culture. The charitable work supported by terrible towel sales, adding meaning and purpose beyond just entertainment. These cultural elements gave the Steelers staying power that transcended any individual player or season. Players would come and go, coaches would change, seasons would bring both success and disappointment, but the cultural identity remained constant. The terrible towel would still wave, Steeler Nation would still show up, the blue-collar values would still define how the team presented itself and how fans understood their connection to it. Myron Cope, that broadcaster with the distinctive voice who had suggested fans bring towels to a playoff game, had created something that outlived him and that will likely outlive everyone who was alive when it began. The terrible towel became immortal, a symbol that will be associated with the Steelers as long as the franchise exists. And the broader cultural transformation, the spread of the fan base, the embrace of blue-collar identity, the connection between team and city, created something equally enduring, a legacy that extends beyond football into the realm of cultural identity and shared community. As fans drift off tonight, perhaps they're clutching their own terrible towels, those pieces of gold fabric that connect them to millions of other fans around the world, that represent decades of tradition and passion, that symbolize everything the Steelers mean to those who follow them. The towel might be worn and faded, might have been passed down through generations, might have been to dozens of games, or just displayed proudly at home. But it represents something real and meaningful: connection, tradition, identity, community. That's what the cultural transformation of the Steelers created, and that's what endures, game after game, season after season, generation after generation. In the National Football League, where coaches are hired and fired with stunning regularity, where a single losing season can cost someone their job, where the pressure to win immediately is relentless and unforgiving, the Pittsburgh Steelers have done something almost unprecedented. They have maintained coaching stability that seems to belong to a different era of professional sports, an era before the modern demands for instant results, before the impatience that characterizes contemporary sports ownership. Since 1969, a span of over 50 years, the Steelers have employed just 3 head coaches. 3 men have guided this franchise through more than 5 decades of football. It's a statistic so remarkable that it almost defies belief. Chuck Noll arrived in 1969, as we've discussed, taking over a franchise that had never won anything, that had struggled since its founding in 1933. He came with a plan, with a systematic approach to building through the draft, with patience and a belief that if you did things the right way, if you built a strong foundation and didn't panic when results didn't come immediately, success would follow. The Rooney family gave him time to implement that plan, didn't fire him after that 1-win season in his first year, didn't lose faith when the immediate results weren't there. And Noll delivered beyond anyone's most optimistic expectations. For Super Bowl victories in 6 years, a dynasty that defined the 1970s, a roster filled with Hall of Fame talent that he had drafted and developed, multiple Coach of the Year honors, recognition as one of the greatest coaches in NFL history. Noll coached the Steelers for 23 seasons, from 1969 through 1991, building not just a championship team, but a culture, an organizational identity, a standard of excellence that would persist long after he stepped down. When Noll finally retired after the 1991 season, the Steelers faced a challenge that many franchises struggle with. How do you replace a legend? How do you follow someone who had been so successful, who had defined the organization for nearly a quarter century? The wrong choice could set the franchise back years, could waste the talent on the roster, could alienate a fan base that had become accustomed to winning and excellence. The Steelers promoted from within, selecting Bill Cowher, who had been serving as the defensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs, but who had roots in Pittsburgh. He had been born in the area and had played linebacker in the NFL. Cowher brought a different style than Noll had possessed. Where Noll was calm and analytical, Cowher was fiery and emotional, prowling the sideline with an intensity that sometimes boiled over into memorable outbursts. His jaw would jut out when he was angry or passionate about a call, creating an expression that became iconic, that was mimicked and celebrated by fans. But beneath the emotional exterior, Cowher was a sound coach, someone who understood defense, who could motivate players, who maintained the organizational commitment to physical football and defensive excellence that Noll had established. The transition was smooth, the culture remained intact, and the winning continued. In Cowher's first season, 1992, the Steelers won 11 games and made the playoffs. The standard had been maintained, the expectations met. Cowher coached the Steelers for 15 seasons, from 1992 through 2006. During that span, he led the team to the playoffs 10 times, won 8 division championships, and reached 2 Super Bowls. The first Super Bowl appearance came after the 1995 season, but the Steelers lost to the Dallas Cowboys, falling short of the championship. That loss haunted Cowher and the organization for years, creating a sense of unfinished business, a feeling that they had come so close but hadn't quite gotten over the top. It took another decade, but Cowher and the Steelers finally broke through. The 2005 season ended with a Super Bowl 40 victory over the Seattle Seahawks, giving Cowher his championship, validating his 15 years of work, adding his name to the list of Steelers coaches who had won Super Bowls. The celebration in Pittsburgh was enormous, another championship for a city that had come to expect them, that had embraced its football team as the primary source of civic pride and joy. Cowher retired after the 2006 season, stepping away on his own terms after 15 years of success, after securing his Super Bowl victory, after establishing his own legacy separate from but connected to what Noll had built. Once again, the Steelers faced the challenge of replacing a successful, beloved coach. And once again, they had to get it right, had to find someone who could maintain the standard, who could keep the winning tradition alive. This time, they went outside the organization, but they chose someone who embodied the qualities they valued. Mike Tomlin was just 34 years old when he was hired in 2007, making him one of the youngest head coaches in NFL history. He had been the defensive coordinator for the Minnesota Vikings, had shown an ability to communicate with and motivate players, had demonstrated the football acumen and leadership qualities the Steelers were looking for. Some questioned the choice. Could someone so young handle the pressure of coaching a franchise with such high expectations? Could he manage veteran players who were older than he was? Could he maintain the culture that Noll and Cowher had built? The doubts were answered quickly and decisively. In Tomlin's second season, 2008, the Steelers won Super Bowl 43, defeating the Arizona Cardinals in a thrilling game that came down to the final minutes. Tomlin became the youngest head coach to ever win a Super Bowl, and he did it with the Steelers' tradition of defensive excellence and physical football fully intact. But Tomlin's success extended far beyond that one championship. He established a level of consistency that is almost unparalleled in modern NFL history. Season after season, year after year, the Steelers under Tomlin remained competitive, remained relevant, remained in playoff contention. Through coaching changes on his staff, through roster turnover as veteran players retired and new ones arrived, through injuries and adversity, Tomlin kept the team winning. The statistic that best captures this consistency is remarkable. Mike Tomlin holds the NFL record for the most consecutive non-losing seasons to begin a coaching career. As of now, he has never had a losing season as head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Not one season where the team finished with more losses than wins. In a league designed for parity, where salary caps and draft systems are meant to prevent sustained success, where even the best teams are supposed to have down years, Tomlin has maintained winning or .500 records for his entire tenure. Think about what that means. Every single year, regardless of injuries, regardless of opponent difficulty, regardless of roster changes, the Steelers under Tomlin have won at least as many games as they've lost. The streak has extended for over 15 seasons now, a run of consistency that seems almost impossible in the modern NFL. It speaks to coaching excellence, to organizational stability, to a culture that demands competitiveness even when championships aren't achieved. So across these three coaches, Noll, Cowher, Tomlin, the Steelers have maintained not just consistency but excellence. All three won Super Bowls. All three established long tenures, coaching for at least 15 seasons. All three maintained the defensive identity and physical style that defines Steelers football. And all three earned the respect and loyalty of the Rooney family, who have shown a patience and commitment to stability that is vanishingly rare in modern professional sports. This coaching consistency is one of the rarest organizational streaks in all of sports, not just football. Compare it to other NFL franchises, which have cycled through dozens of head coaches in the same time span, which have fired coaches after 2 or 3 seasons when immediate success didn't materialize, which have lurched from one philosophy to another without ever establishing continuity or building something lasting. The Steelers' approach stands in stark contrast. Hire good people, give them time to succeed, trust them to maintain the culture, and only make changes when they choose to step away rather than firing them the moment things get difficult. This stability has created enormous advantages for the franchise. Players know what to expect when they come to Pittsburgh, know that the coaching staff will be consistent, that the system won't change dramatically from year to year. Free agents are attracted by the stability, by the knowledge that they're joining an organization that doesn't panic, that builds for sustained success rather than chasing quick fixes. Draft picks develop within consistent systems, with coaches who will be there for their entire careers rather than having to learn new schemes every few years when coaching changes happen. The culture that has been built across these 3 coaching tenures is self-reinforcing. Young coaches and assistants come to Pittsburgh and learn the Steelers' way. The emphasis on defense, the physical style of play, the expectation of competitiveness regardless of circumstances. When these assistants leave to take head coaching jobs elsewhere, they carry elements of that culture with them, spreading Steelers' DNA throughout the NFL. But the core remains in Pittsburgh, maintained across coaching changes, preserved through the transitions from Noll to Cowher to Tomlin. The Rooney family deserves enormous credit for this stability. In an era when most NFL owners fire coaches at the first sign of trouble, when pressure from fans and media can push ownership into making rash decisions, the Rooneys have remained patient and committed to their coaches. They've understood that building something lasting requires time, that coaches need to work through difficulties rather than being discarded when challenges arise, that stability itself has value beyond just any individual season's results. This approach has been validated by the results. 3 coaches, 6 Super Bowl victories between them, decades of playoff appearances and division championships, a level of sustained excellence that few franchises can match. The Steelers haven't just been good occasionally. They've been good consistently, maintaining competitiveness across different eras of football, through rule changes and evolving strategies, through the retirements of Hall of Fame players and the arrival of new stars. As Mike Tomlin continues to coach, as his non-losing season streak extends year after year, he's adding to a legacy that connects directly to what Chuck Noll built in 1969 and what Bill Cowher maintained through the 1990s and early 2000s. The thread remains unbroken, the culture intact, the standard of excellence maintained. 3 head coaches across 50-plus years, all of them champions, all of them building on what came before while adding their own contributions to the Steelers' story. In the restless, impatient world of modern professional sports, where instant results are demanded and patience is seen as weakness, the Pittsburgh Steelers stand as a counterexample, as proof that stability and consistency can produce sustained excellence that quick fixes and constant changes never achieve. 3 coaches, decades of success, a culture that endures. It's one of the most remarkable organizational achievements in sports history, and it continues to define the Pittsburgh Steelers as they move forward, building on that foundation of coaching excellence that began over 50 years ago and shows no signs of ending. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, as Three Rivers Stadium aged and the NFL entered a new era of state-of-the-art facilities, Pittsburgh faced a decision about the future of its sports venues. Three Rivers had served the city well for 30 years, hosting those 4 Super Bowl championship teams, witnessing the immaculate reception and countless other memorable moments. But by the late 1990s, the stadium was showing its age, and both the Steelers and the Pirates were pushing for new, modern facilities that would better serve their needs and enhance the fan experience. The decision was made to build separate stadiums for football and baseball, ending the era of multi-purpose venues that had characterized the Three Rivers generation. For the Steelers, this meant the opportunity to create a football-specific stadium, designed from the ground up to showcase the game and provide the best possible experience for fans. But more than that, it was an opportunity to create something that would connect the stadium to Pittsburgh itself, that would celebrate the city and make its presence felt throughout the venue and on television broadcasts watched by millions around the country. Construction began in 1999, and by the summer of 2001, the new stadium was ready. It was originally named Heinz Field, after the H.J. Heinz Company, the Pittsburgh-based food processing giant known worldwide for its ketchup and other products. The naming rights deal brought significant revenue to help fund construction, but it also connected the stadium to Pittsburgh's business heritage, to one of the companies that had helped define the city's economy beyond just steel production. The stadium's design was deliberate and thoughtful, incorporating elements that would make it distinctly Pittsburgh's home. But perhaps the most striking choice was what the designers chose not to include: walls that would block views of the city. Instead, the stadium was built with openness in mind, with one end left open to provide stunning sight lines to downtown Pittsburgh's skyline. From seats throughout the stadium, fans could see the city rising behind the end zone, the office towers, and the distinctive skyline, creating a backdrop that was constantly visible, constantly reminding everyone where they were. The setting was remarkable. The stadium sits on the North Shore, along the Allegheny River, with water visible from the stands, with bridges connecting the stadium area to downtown Pittsburgh. The three rivers, the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio, are all nearby, creating the geographic context that has defined Pittsburgh since its founding. The designers embraced this setting rather than hiding it, making the stadium feel integrated into the city rather than isolated from it. This openness served multiple purposes. For fans in attendance, it created a connection to the place, a constant reminder that this was Pittsburgh's stadium, built in Pittsburgh, for Pittsburgh. The views of the skyline and the rivers made the stadium feel less like a generic sports venue that could be anywhere and more like something that could only exist in this specific location. Even visitors from opposing teams, coming to Pittsburgh for the first time, would immediately understand where they were, would see the city rising beyond the field, would recognize Pittsburgh's distinctive character. But the open design also served television viewers, the millions of people watching Steelers games on broadcasts from around the country and around the world. Camera angles could incorporate the skyline, showing off Pittsburgh to the viewing audience, creating memorable images that associated the Steelers with their city in visual ways that indoor stadiums or closed venues couldn't achieve. Sunset games were particularly striking, with the sky changing colors behind the skyline, with the lights of the city coming on as evening fell, creating backdrops that were genuinely beautiful and distinctive. This was marketing genius, whether intentional or simply a happy accident of good design. Every Steelers home game became a showcase for Pittsburgh itself, free advertising for the city, images broadcast to massive audiences that associated Pittsburgh with football, with the Steelers, with a setting that was urban but also surrounded by natural elements like rivers and hills. For a city that had struggled with its image as the steel industry declined, as the perception of Pittsburgh as perpetually smoggy and industrial persisted even decades after the air had cleared, these broadcasts helped redefine how people across the country saw the city. The stadium name changed in 2022 when Acrisure, an insurance brokerage, purchased the naming rights. The change was met with some resistance from fans who had grown accustomed to Heinz Field, who associated that name with 2 decades of Steelers football, including a Super Bowl victory. But the stadium itself remained the same, the views unchanged, the connection to Pittsburgh undiminished by a corporate name change. Inside the stadium, the design maintained the Steelers' identity and the connection to Pittsburgh's industrial heritage. Steel beams were left exposed in places, celebrating the material that had built both the city and the stadium itself. The black and gold colors were everywhere, from the seats to the signage to the massive, terrible towels that adorned various sections. The atmosphere on game days was designed to be intimidating for opponents, with the famous Steelers crowd noise amplified by the stadium's acoustic design, creating a wall of sound that made communication difficult for visiting offenses. But the stadium itself is just the beginning of the game day experience. What happens outside the venue, in the hours before kickoff, has become equally central to Steelers culture and to Pittsburgh's identity as a football city. The tailgating on the North Shore before Steelers games has evolved into something remarkable, something that goes beyond just fans grilling in parking lots and becomes closer to a massive, citywide celebration of football and community. The North Shore area, stretching along the river near the stadium, transforms on game days into what can only be described as a massive block party. Thousands of fans arrive hours before kickoff, setting up elaborate tailgate operations with grills and tables and decorations. The smell of grilling meat fills the air, not just hot dogs and hamburgers, but Pittsburgh specialties, foods that connect to the city's cultural heritage and to traditions that have been passed down through generations. Pierogies sizzle on griddles, kielbasa cooks over open flames, the foods of Pittsburgh's Eastern European immigrant communities mixed with American barbecue traditions. Music plays from car stereos and portable speakers, creating a soundtrack that varies from group to group, classic rock, country, hip-hop, whatever fits the tastes of that particular tailgating crew. The terrible towels are everywhere, hanging from vehicles, waved enthusiastically, draped over tables and chairs. People wear their Steelers jerseys with pride, displaying the names of current stars and retired legends alike, creating a visual history of the franchise spread across thousands of fans. What makes the North Shore tailgating special isn't just the scale, though that's impressive. It's the spirit, the inclusiveness, the sense that this is a community event open to everyone who wants to participate. Groups welcome strangers who stop by, offer food and drinks to fellow fans, create connections based on nothing more than shared allegiance to the black and gold. Families with young children tailgate next to college students, next to older fans who have been coming to games for decades. The common thread is the Steelers, but what develops is something larger, a sense of belonging, of community, of shared identity and purpose. The tailgating isn't confined to just the immediate stadium area. It spreads throughout the North Shore, into parking lots and parks, along the riverfront, creating a zone of celebration that encompasses a significant portion of this part of the city. Walking through the area on game day means encountering countless individual gatherings, each with its own character and traditions, but all part of the larger celebration of Steelers football. For visitors coming to Pittsburgh for games, the North Shore tailgating scene is often a revelation. They arrive expecting a typical stadium parking lot experience, and instead find themselves in the middle of something much larger and more engaging. Many visiting fans talk about how welcoming Steelers fans are in these settings, how despite the intense rivalry on the field, the tailgating atmosphere is inclusive and friendly, focused on celebrating football and community rather than hostility toward opponents. The local businesses on the North Shore have adapted to and embraced this game day culture. Bars and restaurants fill to capacity before and after games, becoming extensions of the tailgating experience. Some fans make these establishments their pre-game gathering spots rather than tailgating in parking lots, creating their own traditions around specific venues that become associated with Steelers Sundays. The economic impact on the North Shore is significant, with game days bringing an influx of spending that supports jobs and businesses throughout the area. The connection between the stadium, the tailgating culture, and the city itself creates a complete game day experience that extends far beyond just watching football. Coming to a Steelers game means participating in something larger, arriving early to tailgate and soak in the atmosphere, watching the game with the Pittsburgh skyline visible in the background, staying afterward to continue celebrations or commiserate over losses, experiencing the city and the team as inseparable elements of a single identity. This integration of stadium, city, and fan culture is what the designers of Heinz Field, now Acrisure Stadium, got so right. They didn't create an isolated sports venue disconnected from its surroundings. They created something that embraced Pittsburgh, showcased it, made it central to the entire experience. The open views of the skyline weren't just aesthetically pleasing. They were a statement about what the Steelers mean to Pittsburgh and what Pittsburgh means to the Steelers. On crisp fall afternoons, when the sun is setting behind the city skyline, when the rivers are reflecting the fading light, when thousands of fans are waving their terrible towels in unison, when the roar of the crowd echoes across the North Shore. These are the moments when the connection between team and city feels most profound, most real, most central to what Steelers football represents. The stadium and its setting, the tailgating traditions on the North Shore, the visual connection to Pittsburgh's skyline and rivers. All of these elements combine to create game day experiences that are distinctly Pittsburgh's own, that couldn't be replicated anywhere else, that make attending Steelers games about more than just watching football. It's about celebrating a city, embracing an identity, participating in traditions that connect current fans to all those who came before, who tailgated in earlier eras, who cheered in old stadiums, who maintained faith through losing seasons and celebrated through championship years. As fans finally head home after games, as the North Shore slowly empties and returns to its normal rhythms, as the stadium lights dim and the city skyline once again dominates the view, the cycle completes itself. The game is over, the tailgates are packed up, but the connection remains, the identity persists, the bond between team and city and fans endures, ready to be renewed and celebrated again when the next game day arrives. As the Steelers move through the decades following their 1970s dynasty, as new players replaced the legends of the Steel Curtain era, as the team evolved and adapted to changing styles of football, one thing remained constant: winning. Not just occasional success, not just brief periods of competitiveness followed by rebuilding years, but sustained excellence across decades, a level of consistent achievement that stands alone in modern NFL history. The foundation built by those 4 Super Bowl victories in the 1970s was just the beginning. In the 2005 season, under Bill Cowher's leadership, the Steelers captured their 5th Super Bowl championship, defeating the Seattle Seahawks in Super Bowl 40. It had been 26 years since their last championship, a generation of fans who had grown up hearing stories about the Steel Curtain but had never experienced a Super Bowl victory themselves. The wait was over, and Pittsburgh celebrated with the same fervor that had greeted those championships in the 1970s. But what made this championship particularly remarkable was how the team achieved it. The Steelers entered the playoffs as the 6th seed in the AFC, the lowest playoff seeding possible, a team that had barely squeezed into the postseason. Most 6th seeds make brief playoff appearances, winning perhaps one game before being eliminated by higher-seeded teams with home field advantage. But these Steelers were different. They won on the road in the wild card round. Then they won again on the road in the divisional round. And again in the AFC Championship. 3 road playoff victories, each one harder than the last, each one requiring the team to go into a hostile environment and find a way to win. By the time they reached the Super Bowl, they had already won 3 playoff games away from home, matching the total number of road wins most Super Bowl champions accumulate in an entire playoff run. The Super Bowl itself was played at a neutral site, as all Super Bowls are, but it represented a 4th consecutive game away from Pittsburgh. When they won, defeating Seattle 21-10, they became the first 6th seed in NFL history to win the Super Bowl, setting a record for road playoff victories in a single postseason with 4 wins away from home. It was a testament to mental toughness, to the ability to win in adverse circumstances, to the championship character that had been built into the organization across decades. 3 years later, in the 2008 season, the Steelers did it again. Mike Tomlin, in just his 2nd season as head coach, led the team to Super Bowl 43, where they faced the Arizona Cardinals in what would become one of the most thrilling Super Bowl games ever played. The game came down to the final minutes, with the Cardinals mounting a late comeback that brought them within striking distance. But the Steelers held on, winning 27-23 on the strength of a legendary catch by Santonio Holmes in the corner of the end zone with just 35 seconds remaining. 6 Super Bowl championships. The Steelers stood alone with this achievement, the first franchise in NFL history to win 6 Super Bowls. No other team had reached this milestone. The dominance of the 1970s, the long championship drought, the triumphs of 2005 and 2008, all of it combined to create a legacy of championship success that was unmatched in professional football. The Steelers maintained that exclusive claim to 6 championships for over a decade, until the New England Patriots won their 6th Super Bowl after the 2018 season, tying Pittsburgh's record. The Patriots would later win a 7th, moving ahead of the Steelers in total championships. But for those years when the Steelers stood alone, when no other franchise could match their 6 Lombardi trophies, it was a source of immense pride for the organization and its fans, validation of decades of excellence, proof that what had been built in Pittsburgh was special and enduring. But championships are just one measure of sustained success. The Steelers' excellence across the modern era is evident in virtually every statistical category that measures organizational achievement. Since the 1970 AFL-NFL merger, the point when the modern NFL structure was established, the Pittsburgh Steelers have posted the best overall winning percentage in the entire league. Not just good, not just competitive, the best. Across more than 50 seasons, through different eras of football, through rule changes and stylistic evolutions, through the retirements of Hall of Famers and the arrival of new stars, the Steelers have won more consistently than any other franchise. Think about what that means. Over half a century of professional football, with 32 teams competing, with salary caps designed to create parity, with draft systems that give advantages to losing teams, the Steelers have still managed to win more than anyone else. It's not just about those Super Bowl seasons. It's about winning 10 or 11 games in seasons when they don't reach the championship. It's about making the playoffs even in rebuilding years. It's about maintaining a standard of competitiveness that never allows the team to fall into extended periods of futility. The playoff appearances tell a similar story. The Steelers have reached the postseason over 30 times since the 1970 merger, participating in the NFL's playoff tournament more often than almost any other franchise. Each playoff appearance represents a successful season, a team that finished strong enough to be among the conference's elite. Some franchises go decades between playoff appearances, struggling through long periods of losing. The Steelers have made the playoffs more often than they've missed it, turning postseason football into an expectation rather than a hope. The division championships number over 20, another mark of sustained excellence. Winning your division means being the best team in your immediate competitive group, the 4 teams you play twice every year, the rivals you know intimately and who know you just as well. 20-plus division titles across 5 decades means that the Steelers have been the dominant force in their division for the majority of the modern NFL era, that they've been the team others were chasing more often than they've been doing the chasing. The Steelers have appeared in 16 AFC championship games, one step away from the Super Bowl, competing for the right to represent the conference in the league's ultimate game. 16 times they've been one of the final 2 teams standing in the AFC, regardless of whether they won all those games and advanced to the Super Bowl. Just reaching this stage requires excellence across an entire season and through multiple playoff rounds. Doing it 16 times speaks to organizational consistency that few franchises can match. These numbers, the playoff appearances, the division titles, the AFC championship appearances, the overall winning percentage, they all tell the same story. The Pittsburgh Steelers have been the model of sustained excellence in the modern NFL, the franchise that has most consistently fielded competitive teams, that has most reliably turned regular seasons into playoff opportunities, that has most successfully maintained standards of achievement across changing eras and evolving circumstances. Individual moments and records add texture to this larger story of success. In a playoff game during the 2016 season, kicker Chris Boswell accomplished something that had never been done before in NFL postseason history. Playing against the Kansas City Chiefs in a divisional round game, Boswell kicked 6 field goals, converting on all 6 attempts from various distances, setting an NFL playoff record that still stands. The Steelers won that game 18-16, advancing to the AFC Championship on the strength of Boswell's perfect kicking performance. It was the kind of achievement that illustrates how success in football comes from contributions across the entire roster, not just from the obvious stars at skill positions. A kicker having a perfect night in the playoffs, making 6 field goals when each one mattered enormously, keeping his team in the game and eventually pushing them ahead. It's the kind of performance that championship organizations get from role players, the kind of excellence in execution that separates winners from losers in close games. The modern Steelers have featured numerous individual stars who have added to the franchise's legacy while building their own. Ben Roethlisberger, the quarterback drafted in 2004, played 18 seasons in Pittsburgh, winning 2 Super Bowls and establishing himself as one of the most productive passers in franchise history. Antonio Brown, before personal issues derailed his career, was one of the most dynamic receivers in football, making all-pro teams and setting franchise receiving records. Troy Polamalu, the safety with the distinctive flowing hair, played with the kind of instinctive brilliance and aggressive style that made him a defensive star and a Hall of Famer. These modern stars carried forward the traditions established by the legends of earlier eras, maintaining the standard of individual excellence that had defined Steelers rosters going back to the 1970s. They wore the same black and gold, played in front of the same passionate fans waving terrible towels, represented the same organizational values of toughness and competitiveness. The names and faces changed across the decades, but the identity remained consistent, the expectations unchanged, the standard of excellence maintained. The success wasn't accidental or lucky. It was the product of organizational philosophy, of the coaching consistency we discussed earlier, of scouting and player development systems that identified and maximized talent, of a culture that demanded competitiveness and accountability from everyone in the organization. The Steelers built something sustainable, something that could persist through roster turnover and coaching transitions, something that was larger than any individual player or season. As the franchise moves forward, as new challenges arise and new players arrive to carry the torch, the modern era's record of success stands as both achievement and expectation. 6 Super Bowl championships, 30-plus playoff appearances, the best overall record since the merger, division titles, and conference championship appearances. All of it creates a legacy that current and future Steelers teams will be measured against, that defines what success means in Pittsburgh, that maintains the standards established over decades of excellence. For fans falling asleep tonight, perhaps dreaming of those championship moments, of Santonio Holmes's catch, or that six-seed playoff run, or Chris Boswell's perfect kicking performance, these modern achievements connect to all that came before. The steel curtain defense of the 1970s, the immaculate reception, Chuck Noll's 4 Super Bowls, it all flows together into a single story of sustained excellence, of a franchise that has been the standard for success in professional football for over half a century. That's the legacy of the modern-era Steelers, and that's what makes them one of the most successful organizations in all of sports, not just football. Throughout the Steelers' history, individual stars have emerged to carry the franchise forward, to embody the values and identity that define Pittsburgh football, to create moments and achievements that become part of the larger story. These aren't just talented athletes who happen to play in black and gold. These are players who became synonymous with the franchise itself, whose names will forever be connected to the Steelers, who gave fans memories that will last lifetimes. When the Steelers selected Ben Roethlisberger in the first round of the 2004 draft, the 11th overall pick from Miami of Ohio, they were taking a chance on a quarterback from a smaller program who hadn't received the same attention as some of the other quarterbacks in that draft class. But the Steelers' scouting staff saw something special: size, arm strength, mobility, and most importantly, the kind of competitive toughness that fit perfectly with Pittsburgh's identity. They believed Roethlisberger could become their franchise quarterback, could be the player who led them back to championship glory. The belief was validated almost immediately. Roethlisberger took over as the starter during his rookie season and led the team to a 13-0 record in games he started, the best start by a rookie quarterback in NFL history. The Steelers made the AFC Championship game that season, falling just short of the Super Bowl, but the foundation was clearly in place. They had found their quarterback, and he was going to be special. The following season, 2005, everything came together. Roethlisberger led the Steelers on that remarkable playoff run as the 6th seed, winning those 4 consecutive road games to capture Super Bowl 40. At just 23 years old, Roethlisberger became the youngest quarterback in NFL history to win a Super Bowl championship. The record still stands today, a testament to how quickly he had developed and how effectively he had seized the moment when given the opportunity. 3 years later, in the 2008 season, Roethlisberger did it again, leading the Steelers to Super Bowl 43 and that thrilling victory over the Arizona Cardinals. His poise in the final drive, his ability to execute under the most intense pressure imaginable, his connection with Santonio Holmes on that game-winning touchdown, all of it demonstrated why the Steelers had been right to believe in him, why he had become the centerpiece of the franchise's modern era. Roethlisberger played 18 seasons in Pittsburgh, from 2004 through 2021, an entire career spent with one franchise in an era when such loyalty has become increasingly rare. Over those 18 years, he rewrote virtually every significant passing record in Steelers history. Most passing yards, over 64,000, nearly double what Terry Bradshaw had accumulated. Most touchdown passes, over 400, a total that would have seemed almost impossible in earlier eras when the game was less pass-oriented. Most completions, most attempts, most games with 300 yards passing, most fourth-quarter comebacks. The list goes on and on. The records tell the story of productivity and longevity, of a player who maintained elite performance across nearly 2 decades. But they don't fully capture what Roethlisberger meant to the franchise and its fans. He played with a toughness that Pittsburgh appreciated, a willingness to take hits and keep playing, to extend plays with his size and mobility even when the pocket collapsed around him. He had a knack for dramatic moments, for making the throw that had to be made when everything was on the line, for delivering in playoff games and crucial regular season matchups. His career had its controversies, certainly, with off-field issues early on that created legitimate concerns and criticism. But on the field, in terms of what he accomplished wearing the black and gold, Roethlisberger's legacy is secure. He's one of the greatest quarterbacks in franchise history, a 2-time Super Bowl champion, a player who gave Pittsburgh 18 years of high-level quarterback play and who will be seriously considered for the Pro Football Hall of Fame when he becomes eligible. While Roethlisberger was establishing himself as the face of the franchise at quarterback, another player was becoming equally beloved and equally central to the team's identity. Hines Ward arrived in Pittsburgh in 1998, a third-round draft pick from Georgia who didn't have the physical tools that typically make receivers first-round selections. He wasn't the fastest player, didn't have elite size, wasn't going to wow anyone with spectacular athleticism. But what Ward had was toughness, reliability, an almost obsessive work ethic, and a willingness to do the dirty work that doesn't show up in highlight reels. Ward became known for his blocking as much as his receiving, throwing devastating blocks on running plays and screen passes, taking pride in pancaking defensive backs and linebackers, playing with a physical edge that seemed more appropriate for a linebacker than a wide receiver. He was smiling and joyful off the field, but between the lines, Ward played with a mean streak, an edge that opposing players complained about, and that Steelers fans absolutely loved. But Ward could catch too. Game after game, season after season, he ran precise routes, found soft spots in coverage, caught passes in traffic, and moved the chains on crucial third downs. He was Ben Roethlisberger's most reliable target for years, the receiver the quarterback could count on to be where he was supposed to be, to fight for extra yards after the catch, to make the play when it mattered most. By the time Ward retired after the 2011 season, he had set franchise records that seemed like they might stand forever. Most receptions in team history, over 1,000 catches, an almost unfathomable total that represented years of consistent production. Most receiving yards, over 12,000, accumulated catch by catch across 14 seasons. Most receiving touchdowns, 85, each one celebrated with that distinctive Hines Ward smile that became one of the most recognizable images in Pittsburgh sports. Ward's crowning achievement came in Super Bowl 40, that championship victory over Seattle after the 2005 season. He was named the game's most valuable player, recognition of his 4 catches for 123 yards and a touchdown, of his blocking that helped spring big runs, of his overall impact on the game. For a player who had been a third-round pick, who hadn't been expected to become a star, winning Super Bowl MVP validated everything he had accomplished, everything he had worked for. Ward's legacy extends beyond just statistics and awards. He represented something important to Pittsburgh fans, the idea that hard work and toughness could overcome athletic limitations, that success came from commitment and effort rather than just natural ability. He was the lunch pail receiver, the player who showed up every day and did his job with a joy and enthusiasm that was infectious. His smile, famous throughout the league, somehow coexisted with his aggressive playing style, creating a persona that was uniquely his own. As the franchise moved into the 2010s and beyond, as Roethlisberger's career wound down and new stars emerged, the defensive tradition that had defined the Steel Curtain era was being carried forward by a new generation of exceptional players. And perhaps no player better exemplified that tradition in the modern era than T.J. Watt, the outside linebacker selected in the first round of the 2017 draft. Watt came from an athletic family. His brothers J.J. and Derek also played in the NFL, but he carved out his own identity in Pittsburgh, becoming one of the most dominant defensive players in football. Playing outside linebacker in the Steelers' defensive scheme, Watt terrorized opposing quarterbacks with a relentless pass rush that combined speed, power, and exceptional technique. He could beat offensive tackles with pure speed around the edge, could bull rush them with power, could use sophisticated hand techniques to shed blocks and get to the quarterback. In the 2021 season, Watt accomplished something that seemed almost impossible in the modern NFL, where rule changes have made it easier to pass and harder to generate consistent pressure. He recorded 22.5 sacks, tying the NFL single-season record that had been set by Michael Strahan 20 years earlier. 22.5 sacks in a single season. It's a staggering total, representing dominance that opponents simply couldn't stop no matter how they tried to block him, no matter how they adjusted their protections. That season was just 1 year in what has become a consistently dominant career. What has been named Defensive Player of the Year, has earned multiple All-Pro selections, has led the league in sacks multiple times. Under his leadership, the Steelers have regularly ranked among the league leaders in total sacks as a team, maintaining the defensive identity that has defined the franchise since the Steel Curtain era. When TJ Watt lines up on the edge, opposing offenses have to account for him on every single play, have to adjust their protections and their game plans, have to hope they can slow him down even if they know they can't stop him completely. What represents the latest generation of Steelers defenders carrying forward a tradition that stretches back to Joe Green and Jack Lambert, that flows through players like Rod Woodson and Troy Polamalu, that continues to define how Pittsburgh approaches football. Defense first. Physical play. Relentless aggression. The names change across the decades, but the identity remains constant, and what embodies that identity as completely as any defender in the modern era. These three players, Roethlisberger, Ward, and Watt, represent different eras and different sides of the ball, but they share common threads that connect them to each other and to the larger Steelers tradition. They played with toughness and competitive fire. They achieved individual excellence while prioritizing team success. They embraced the blue-collar identity that Pittsburgh represents. They gave everything they had every time they stepped on the field, playing through injuries, refusing to quit, demonstrating the kind of mental and physical toughness that Steelers fans demand and appreciate. Their individual records and achievements, Roethlisberger's passing marks, Ward's receiving records, Watt's sack totals, these will stand in the team's record books for years, perhaps decades. Future players will chase these marks, will be compared to these legends, will try to match what they accomplished. Some may succeed, may eventually break the records and establish new standards. But the memories of watching these players, of seeing Roethlisberger engineer comebacks and Ward smile after devastating blocks and what chased down quarterbacks, those memories will persist regardless of what future record books say. This is how franchises maintain their identity across generations, how traditions are passed down, how current fans connect with those who came before. The steel curtain gave way to new defensive stars, who gave way to Watt and his contemporaries. Bradshaw's passing records fell to Roethlisberger, whose marks will eventually fall to future quarterbacks. The game evolves, the statistics inflate, but the core identity, toughness, competitiveness, team-first mentality, blue-collar values, remains constant, embodied by each new generation of stars who wear the black and gold. Beyond the players and the championships, beyond the statistics and the records, there exists another layer to the Steelers' experience. The rituals and traditions that fans have created and maintained, the songs and superstitions and shared experiences that turn attending games from simply watching football into something closer to participating in a communal ceremony. These traditions give structure and meaning to game days, create connections between strangers who share nothing except their allegiance to the black and gold, and transform a stadium full of individuals into something unified and powerful. Walk into Acrisure Stadium on a game day when the Steelers' defense is about to take the field in a crucial situation, when the momentum needs to shift, when the crowd needs to reach its highest intensity. The lights might dim slightly, and then, through the speakers, the opening notes of a song from 1978 begin to play. Renegade by Styx. The crowd recognizes it instantly, and the reaction is immediate and visceral. 60,000 fans rise to their feet, begin to wave their terrible towels, and the noise level builds with each passing second. The song wasn't written for football, wasn't composed with any connection to the Steelers or to Pittsburgh. It's a rock anthem from the late 1970s, a song about an outlaw on the run, with driving rhythms and an intensity that builds throughout. But somehow, in ways that are difficult to trace precisely, Renegade became the Steelers' defensive anthem, the song that plays when the defense needs inspiration, when the crowd needs to reach maximum volume, when the stadium needs to become as intimidating and hostile as possible for the opposing offense. The tradition solidified in the mid-2000s, during the playoff runs that led to Super Bowl championships. The song would play, the crowd would go absolutely wild, and the defense would feed off that energy, making crucial stops, forcing turnovers, changing the momentum of games. The connection became established in fans' minds. When Renegade plays, something good is about to happen. The defense is about to make a play. The tide is about to turn in Pittsburgh's favor. Opposing teams began to dread hearing Renegade at Acrisure Stadium. It meant the crowd was at its loudest, the environment at its most hostile, the Steelers' defense at its most energized. Quarterbacks couldn't hear their own signals. Offensive linemen couldn't hear snap counts. Plays broke down before they even began, simply because the noise made communication impossible. And psychologically, hearing that song, seeing those 60,000 terrible towels waving in unison, feeling that wall of sound washing over the field, it affected opposing players, created doubt, made the task of moving the ball seem even more daunting than it already was. The phenomenon has been studied and discussed, with sports psychologists analyzing how crowd noise and environmental factors affect athletic performance, how the psychological impact of a hostile crowd can be as significant as any physical challenge. Renegade at Acrisure Stadium became a case study, an example of home field advantage taken to its maximum expression, of fans genuinely affecting outcomes through the intensity and unity of their support. The song has created countless memorable moments. Crucial fourth-down stops after Renegade played, interceptions returned for touchdowns while the song was still echoing through the stadium, goal line stands that preserved victories and playoff hopes. Each of these moments reinforced the tradition, deepened the connection between the song and defensive success, made Renegade even more central to the game day experience. For fans who've attended dozens or hundreds of games, who've waved their terrible towels to Renegade countless times, the song is inseparable from their experience of Steelers football, as much a part of the tradition as the black and gold colors or the team logo. But Renegade isn't the only song that defines the Steelers' musical identity. There's another piece of music, much older, much simpler, that has become equally central to how fans express their support and celebrate their team. The Steelers' fight song, officially titled Here We Go, is a cheerful, almost childlike melody with simple lyrics that are easy to sing along with, easy to remember, easy to teach to children who are attending their first games. Here we go, Steelers, here we go. The refrain repeats throughout the song, punctuated by rhythmic clapping and cheering. There's nothing sophisticated about it, nothing complex or artistically ambitious. It's a fight song in the classic tradition, meant to be sung by crowds, to unify voices, to create a shared expression of support that rises from the stands and carries across the field. The song plays throughout the game, but especially when the Steelers score, when celebrations are in order, when the mood is jubilant rather than tense. Families sing it together, teaching the words to young children who will carry on the tradition. It plays at rallies and watch parties, at bars filled with Steelers fans gathered to watch away games, at tailgates before kickoff. Here We Go has become one of those cultural touchstones that extends beyond just the stadium, that represents Steelers fandom in general, that serves as a rallying cry and celebration rolled into one simple melody. The simplicity is part of the appeal. You don't need to be musical to sing along, don't need to know complicated lyrics or follow complex rhythms. You just join in, adding your voice to thousands of others, participating in something larger than yourself. When a stadium full of fans sings, Here We Go, in unison, when the voices blend together into something unified and powerful, it creates a moment of connection and community that transcends the game itself. These songs, Renegade for intensity and defensive inspiration, Here We Go for celebration and unity, provide the soundtrack to Steelers game days, creating audio cues that trigger emotional responses in fans who've heard them countless times. The first notes of Renegade create anticipation and excitement, a Pavlovian response built through years of association with big defensive plays. The opening of Here We Go creates joy and celebration, a signal that something good has happened or is about to happen. Beyond the music, there are superstitions that have taken hold in Steelers culture, beliefs that may not stand up to rational analysis, but that persist nonetheless because sports fans are, by nature, superstitious people looking for any edge, any way to influence outcomes, even when they're sitting in the stands or watching from home. And no superstition in Steelers lore is more discussed, more debated, more genuinely believed by some fans than the terrible towel curse. The legend holds that disrespecting the terrible towel brings bad luck. Not just ordinary bad luck, but catastrophic, career-ending, franchise-destroying bad luck. The stories have accumulated over the years. Opposing players who stomped on terrible towels or used them in mocking celebrations, then suffered injuries shortly afterward. Coaches who made disparaging comments about the towel, then watched their teams collapse. Franchises that allowed their players to disrespect the terrible towel, then endured losing streaks and playoff failures. The rational mind understands that correlation doesn't equal causation, that coincidences happen, that athletes get injured and teams go through slumps for reasons that have nothing to do with whether someone was respectful toward a piece of gold-colored fabric. But the stories persist, the examples accumulate, and many fans genuinely believe, or at least half believe, or believe enough not to tempt fate, that the terrible towel possesses some kind of mystical power that punishes those who disrespect it. The belief is strengthened by the charitable aspect of the terrible towel that we discussed earlier, by the fact that proceeds benefit individuals with developmental disabilities. Disrespecting the towel isn't just insulting Steelers fans. It's indirectly disrespecting a cause that helps vulnerable people, which makes the supposed curse feel almost karmically justified. Mock the towel, suffer the consequences. It's a narrative that feels satisfying on a deeper level than just sports rivalry. Whether the curse is real or simply confirmation bias, and selective memory doesn't really matter to its cultural impact. The belief exists, the stories circulate, and opposing players have learned to be cautious around terrible towels, knowing that even if the curse isn't real, disrespecting it will certainly enrage Steelers fans and might create the kind of hostile environment that makes winning in Pittsburgh even more difficult. The superstition serves a purpose regardless of its truth. It adds mystique to the terrible towel tradition, gives fans something to believe in, creates stories and legends that become part of the larger Steelers mythology. These rituals and traditions, the songs and the superstitions, the terrible towels and the fight songs, create the texture of Steelers fandom, the details that make supporting this team different from supporting any other. Every franchise has its traditions, certainly, but the Steelers have a depth and a reach that's unusual, that extends across generations and across geographic boundaries, that unifies Steeler Nation whether they're in Pittsburgh or Phoenix or anywhere else. A child attending their first Steelers game learns to wave their terrible towel when Renegade plays, learns to sing along with Here We Go, learns the stories about the curse and the traditions that their parents and grandparents have passed down. They're being initiated into something larger than just sports fandom. They're joining a community with shared rituals and beliefs, with songs that mean something specific and important, with traditions that connect them to millions of others who share their allegiance to the black and gold. The game itself might be the reason people come to the stadium, but these rituals and traditions are part of what keeps them coming back, what makes each game feel like an event rather than just a sporting contest, what creates memories that last beyond just remembering who won or what the final score was. Decades later, fans remember the times they sang Here We Go after touchdowns, remember when Renegade played and the defense made a crucial stop, remember discussing the curse with friends and debating whether it was real or just coincidence. Football is more than just a game played in isolation. It's a sport defined by rivalries, by repeated battles against the same opponents, by histories that build over decades of competition until the matchups take on meaning that transcends any individual season or game. And few franchises in the NFL have developed rivalries as intense, as storied, as genuinely meaningful as the Pittsburgh Steelers. The AFC North Division has become a crucible of physical football, of grudges and memorable moments, of games that fans remember for years after they're played. The oldest of the Steelers' rivalries stretches back to 1950, when Cleveland and Pittsburgh first faced each other as division rivals in the newly reorganized NFL. The Browns and the Steelers have been playing each other twice a year for over 7 decades now, accumulating more than 140 games of shared history, creating a rivalry that spans generations of players and fans. This is football history in its purest form. 2 cities separated by just 130 miles, 2 working-class communities with similar identities, competing for supremacy in a sport that both have embraced as central to their civic pride. In the early decades of this rivalry, Cleveland held the upper hand. During those long years when the Steelers were struggling, when they couldn't win playoff games or division titles, the Browns were one of the dominant forces in professional football. They won championships, they fielded Hall of Fame players, and they regularly defeated Pittsburgh, adding to the frustration of Steelers fans who watched their team lose to their closest geographic rival year after year. But the tables turned in the 1970s, when the Steelers built their dynasty and the Browns, despite having competitive teams, couldn't quite reach the same heights. The rivalry became more balanced, more heated, with both sides experiencing triumph and heartbreak. Games between Cleveland and Pittsburgh were almost always physical, hard-fought affairs, with neither team giving an inch, with every yard contested, with the kind of intensity that comes from familiarity and genuine dislike. One game stands out in this rivalry's long history for all the wrong reasons if you're a Steelers fan. September 10th, 1989. The season opener. Pittsburgh traveled to Cleveland, and what followed was a humiliation so complete, so overwhelming, that it remains difficult to watch even for fans who weren't alive when it happened. The Browns demolished the Steelers, 51-0. 51-0. The worst defeat in franchise history, a shutout loss so lopsided that it seemed to belong in a different sport entirely, not a game between two professional football teams. The Browns scored early and often, and the Steelers simply had no answer. The offense couldn't move the ball, the defense couldn't stop Cleveland, and as the score mounted, as the game became increasingly one-sided, a sense of shock settled over everyone watching. This wasn't supposed to happen to the Steelers, especially not in a rivalry game, especially not at the hands of the Browns. But it did happen, and the score went into the record books as a painful reminder that even the greatest franchises have their darkest days. For Browns fans, that 51-0 victory became a cherished memory, a moment when their team had dominated their rival so completely that it seemed like the natural order of the football universe. They held on to that game, that score, through the difficult years that would follow, through the franchise's move to Baltimore and the 3-year absence of the Browns from the NFL. The Cleveland Browns franchise moved to Baltimore in 1996, becoming the Ravens and leaving Cleveland without professional football for the first time in decades. But the NFL, responding to the outcry from Cleveland fans and the city's political leadership, promised that football would return. A new Browns franchise would be established, maintaining the name and the history and the records of the original team. The colors would stay the same, the traditions would continue, and Cleveland would have its football team back. In 1999, the new Cleveland Browns took the field for the first time. Their opponent in that inaugural game? The Pittsburgh Steelers, naturally. The rivalry would resume where it had left off, with Cleveland and Pittsburgh facing each other in a game that carried enormous symbolic weight. For Browns fans, this was about more than just winning a football game. It was about reclaiming their identity, about showing that Cleveland football was back and ready to compete. What happened that day must have felt like cruel cosmic justice to Steelers fans who had endured that 51-0 humiliation a decade earlier. The Steelers didn't just beat the new Browns, they destroyed them. The final score was 43-0, a shutout victory almost as lopsided as that terrible loss from 1989, a statement that the Steelers were still the dominant force in this rivalry, that Cleveland's return to the NFL wouldn't change the balance of power. The Browns' comeback season began with a defeat so thorough that it seemed designed to extinguish any celebration or joy that the return might have generated. But as intense as the Browns' rivalry is, as much history as it carries, many observers believe that the Steelers' most bitter, most physically brutal rivalry in the modern era isn't with Cleveland. It's with the team that used to be Cleveland, the franchise that moved to Baltimore and became the Ravens. The Steelers-Ravens rivalry has become perhaps the premier divisional matchup in the entire NFL, a twice-yearly collision of similar teams with similar identities playing similar styles of football. The Ravens inherited some of Cleveland's roster when they moved to Baltimore, and they quickly established themselves as a defensive powerhouse in the AFC. Like the Steelers, the Ravens built their identity around physical defense, around stopping the run, around pressuring quarterbacks and creating turnovers. When these two teams play, it's rarely high-scoring or aesthetically beautiful. It's trench warfare, a grinding battle where field position and defense and special teams often matter more than offensive fireworks. The games are brutal. Players from both teams talk about how much harder they hit in Steelers-Ravens games, how much more physical the matchups are, how every play feels like a battle. The respect between the teams is real. Both organizations recognize the other as a worthy adversary, but so is the animosity. These aren't friendly competitions. These are wars, fought with barely contained violence within the rules of football, with players leaving everything on the field, and often leaving with injuries to show for their effort. The playoff meetings have added another layer to this rivalry. The Ravens and Steelers have faced each other multiple times in the postseason, with each game feeling like it could go either way, with both teams knowing each other so well that the margins become razor-thin. These playoff games have produced memorable moments, dramatic finishes, controversial calls, injuries to key players that changed the course of seasons. Each postseason meeting adds to the lore, gives both fan bases new moments to remember or to regret, depending on the outcome. The defensive battles have become legendary. Final scores of 13-10, 17-14, games where touchdowns are rare and field goals precious, where a single turnover might determine the winner. These aren't the games that casual fans necessarily enjoy. There's not enough scoring, not enough offensive excitement. But for purists, for people who appreciate defense and physicality and strategic chess matches, Steelers-Ravens games represent football at its most fundamental level. This is what the sport was like before rule changes favored offense, before passing became so dominant. This is old-school, smash-mouth football, and it's still being played twice a year when these two teams meet. The rivalry with the Cincinnati Bengals is different in character, but no less intense. Where the Ravens' matchups are built on mutual respect between similar teams, the Bengals-Steelers rivalry often feels more personal, more emotional, defined by chippy play and heated moments that sometimes cross the line from competitive to genuinely dangerous. The rivalry escalated significantly in the 2000s and 2010s, when both teams were consistently good, consistently competing for division titles and playoff spots. The games became increasingly physical, increasingly emotional, with penalties piling up, with players jawing at each other throughout, with a sense that things might boil over at any moment into something uglier than just hard-fought football. The 2005 playoff game between these teams was a turning point. The Bengals had finished with a better record than Pittsburgh, had earned home field advantage in the wild card round, and seemed poised to finally break through and win a playoff game after a long drought. But early in the game, Bengals quarterback Carson Palmer, their franchise player and leader, dropped back to pass and was hit low by Steelers defensive tackle Kimo von Oelhoffen. Palmer's knee buckled, ligaments tearing, and he crumpled to the ground in obvious agony. The injury changed everything. Palmer was done for the day, done for the playoffs, and the Bengals' hopes of advancing went with him. Pittsburgh won the game and would eventually go on to win Super Bowl 40, while Cincinnati was left to wonder what might have been if their quarterback had stayed healthy. Bengals fans blamed the Steelers for the hit, seeing it as intentionally dirty rather than just an unfortunate football play. The animosity deepened, the grudge growing into something that would color the rivalry for years to come. 10 years later, in the 2015 playoffs, the two teams met again in the wild card round. This time the game was in Cincinnati, and the Bengals seemed to have control late, leading by a touchdown with just over a minute remaining. They were about to exorcise the demons of that 2005 loss, about to finally beat Pittsburgh in the playoffs and advance. But then everything fell apart in spectacular fashion. The Steelers marched down the field in desperation mode, with backup quarterback Landry Jones. Ben Roethlisberger had been injured earlier in the game, somehow moving the offense into Bengals territory. With seconds remaining, Jones found receiver Antonio Brown for a completion that moved the chains and stopped the clock. But on the play, Bengals linebacker Vontaze Burfict delivered a vicious hit to Brown's head, a clear penalty that drew a flag and moved the ball 15 yards closer to field goal range. The Bengals still might have survived that penalty, might have forced Pittsburgh into a very long field goal attempt. But then Bengals cornerback Adam Jones got into a confrontation with Steelers assistant coach Joey Porter, who had come onto the field to check on the injured Brown. Another personal foul was called, another 15 yards, and suddenly the Steelers were in comfortable field goal range. Kicker Chris Boswell converted, and Pittsburgh won the game in stunning fashion, advancing while Cincinnati dealt with the devastation of having victory torn away by their own undisciplined mistakes. The meltdown became infamous, replayed endlessly, analyzed and discussed as one of the most shocking endings in playoff history. Bengals fans were left in agony, having watched their team collapse in the most painful way possible against their most hated rival. Steelers fans celebrated, but with a certain uncomfortable awareness that the way they'd won, on the back of opponent mistakes and a controversial sequence of events, left a bad taste even in victory. The Super Bowl, the culmination of a season's work, the ultimate stage, the game that defines legacies and creates moments that echo through football history. For the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have appeared in 8 Super Bowls and won 6 of them, these championship games have produced some of the most dramatic, most memorable moments in the entire history of the sport. Some brought triumph and validation. Some brought heartbreak and regret. But all of them became part of the Steelers' story, defining chapters in the franchise's long journey. Super Bowl XIII, played in January of 1979 at the Orange Bowl in Miami, matched the Pittsburgh Steelers against the Dallas Cowboys in a rematch of Super Bowl X 3 years earlier. Both teams were dynasties, both were loaded with Hall of Fame talent, and both were at the peak of their powers. This wasn't just a championship game. It was a collision between the two best teams of the era, a contest to determine which franchise would be remembered as the dominant force of the 1970s. The game lived up to the build-up, and then some. Points were scored, momentum swung back and forth. Great plays were made by players on both sides. Terry Bradshaw threw for over 300 yards and 4 touchdowns, playing perhaps the best game of his career on the biggest stage possible. Lynn Swann and John Stallworth made spectacular catches, breaking free from Dallas's coverage to haul in long touchdowns that put the Steelers ahead. The Cowboys fought back repeatedly, scoring their own touchdowns, keeping the game close and competitive throughout. The fourth quarter was tense, with both teams trading scores, with the outcome uncertain until the final minutes. When the clock finally ran out, the Steelers had prevailed, 35-31, in a game that many observers, players, coaches, historians, and fans consider one of the greatest Super Bowls ever played. It wasn't just that the score was close or that both teams played well. It was that everything that makes football exciting was on display. Big plays, crucial mistakes, momentum shifts, stars rising to the occasion, the constant tension of not knowing which team would ultimately prevail. For the Steelers, that victory was their 3rd Super Bowl championship, confirming their status as the dominant team of the decade. For Terry Bradshaw, who was named the game's most valuable player, it was validation of his development from struggling young quarterback to championship leader. The game entered the pantheon of Super Bowl classics, the standard against which future championships would be measured. But the Steelers weren't done creating Super Bowl moments. 3 decades later, in Super Bowl 43 played in February of 2009 at Raymond James Stadium in Tampa, Pittsburgh faced the Arizona Cardinals in another game that would come down to the final seconds. The Steelers were defending champions, having won Super Bowl 43 years earlier, and they were favored against the Cardinals, who had emerged from the NFC as a surprising Super Bowl representative. The first half of the game produced a moment that would become one of the most replayed, most celebrated defensive plays in Super Bowl history. Late in the second quarter, with the Steelers leading 10-7, the Cardinals were driving, threatening to take the lead or at least tie the game before halftime. On the final play of the half, Cardinals quarterback Kurt Warner threw toward the end zone, looking for a touchdown that would swing momentum in Arizona's favor. But Steelers linebacker James Harrison read the play perfectly. He stepped in front of the intended receiver, intercepted the pass at the goal line, and instead of simply batting the ball down or kneeling to end the half, he began to run. Harrison was not a fast player. Linebackers rarely are, but he had the entire field in front of him, 100 yards of green grass between him and the opposite end zone. Cardinals players gave chase, trying to tackle him, trying to prevent what was about to happen. Harrison ran the full length of the field, somehow staying on his feet despite being exhausted, despite several Cardinals getting their hands on him, despite the weight of his equipment and the oxygen debt building in his lungs. He crossed the goal line as time expired in the first half, completing a 100-yard interception return for a touchdown, the longest play in Super Bowl history. Instead of Arizona taking the lead or tying the game, Pittsburgh went into halftime with a 17-7 advantage, a 14-point swing that resulted from one incredible defensive play. The image of Harrison, collapsing in the end zone after his run, completely spent from the effort, became iconic. Teammates rushed to celebrate with him while he lay on the ground trying to catch his breath. That play changed the game's entire trajectory, gave the Steelers a cushion they would need, and created a moment that will be remembered as long as the Super Bowl is played. But the game wasn't over. The Cardinals, led by the veteran Kurt Warner, fought back in the second half. They scored touchdowns, closed the gap, and with less than 3 minutes remaining, they took a 23-20 lead on a spectacular touchdown catch of their own. The Steelers, who had seemed in control, suddenly faced defeat, suddenly needed their offense to respond or their championship defense would end in failure. Ben Roethlisberger and the offense took the field, needing to drive the length of the field with time running out. The drive was methodical, moving from one first down to the next, with Roethlisberger making key throws to keep the chains moving, to keep the clock manageable. As they approached the end zone, as the final seconds ticked away, Roethlisberger dropped back and threw toward the back corner of the end zone, where receiver Santonio Holmes was running a fade route, covered tightly by the Cardinals' defender. The ball arrived at exactly the right moment, placed where only Holmes could catch it. Holmes extended his arms, pulled the ball in, and, this is the crucial detail that makes the catch legendary, got both feet down in bounds, his toes touching the green grass inside the white boundary line before his heels came down out of bounds. It was a toe-tap catch, requiring perfect body control and awareness, executed under the most intense pressure imaginable, with the Super Bowl championship hanging in the balance. The officials reviewed the play, examining it from every angle, looking for any reason to overturn the call. But the catch was perfect, undeniably legal, and the touchdown stood. The Steelers had taken the lead with 35 seconds remaining. The Cardinals got the ball back one more time, but couldn't produce a miracle finish of their own. And when the final seconds expired, Pittsburgh had won 27-23 in another Super Bowl instant classic. Santonio Holmes was named the game's most valuable player, recognition of his 4 catches for 73 yards and that game-winning touchdown, but especially for the degree of difficulty on that final catch, for the poise he showed in making it, for the awareness to get his feet down in bounds. The toe-tap catch joined James Harrison's 100-yard interception return in the catalog of legendary Super Bowl moments. 2 plays from the same game that would be replayed endlessly, that would define that championship and become part of NFL mythology. But Super Bowl history isn't only about triumph. The Steelers have also experienced defeat on football's biggest stage, and those losses carry their own weight, their own painful memories that fans would prefer to forget, but that remain part of the complete story. For fans falling asleep tonight, perhaps these Super Bowl moments drift through consciousness. The joy of watching Harrison rumble the full length of the field, or the tension of that final drive against Arizona. These are the games that define franchises, that separate the merely good teams from the truly great ones, that create the memories and moments that fans carry with them for lifetimes. The Steelers have been there 8 times, have stood on that biggest of stages, have experienced both the ecstasy of victory and the agony of defeat. And in both triumph and loss, they've created moments that will be remembered, discussed, and celebrated as long as professional football is played.